The people sent in to clean up Chernobyl's radioactive mess barely survived the work, and some didn't. A massive blob of radioactive material sits under the plant, so deadly that just standing near it for a minute could kill, and black fungus is growing inside the abandoned reactor, feeding on the radiation itself. These are disturbing photos taken inside Chernobyl after the disaster. In 1986, right after the Chernobyl disaster, a group of people known as the liquidators were called in to clean up the radioactive mess. This photo shows some of them at work, and if you look closely at the bottom, you'll see these strange white streaks on the film. Those are actually caused by radiation. A lot of these workers were not trained specifically for this type of work. Some were firefighters and soldiers, but there were also regular people thrown into the fire. They didn't have much protective gear, so some of them had to improvise with whatever they could find, like leather and lead plates. They worked in insane conditions, dealing with radiation levels that would have made most people collapse, and a lot of them ended up seriously sick later. Some died from exposure, and despite all that, they kept going, trying to contain one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. This photo shows one of the most infamous spots inside Chernobyl, the Elephant's Foot. Right after the 1986 explosion, a lot of the molten reactor core sank beneath the plant, and what formed was this massive wrinkled blob of radioactive sludge made from melted fuel, metal, sand, and concrete. It got its name because, as you can probably tell, it kind of looks like the thick, wrinkly skin of an elephant. Back when it first formed, it was insanely deadly. Just standing nearby for a few minutes would kill you. To even get a picture, people had to bounce cameras off mirrors so no one had to actually get too close. The heat was so intense it was literally burning through the floors beneath it. Nowadays it's cooled down and isn't instantly lethal, but it's still one of the most radioactive things on planet Earth, sealed off deep in the plant. What you're looking at here is a black fungus that's been growing in various parts of Chernobyl. It grows toward radiation. The fungus is called, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Cladosporium sphaerospermum. This is a photo of it spreading on the walls of the reactor's damaged areas. It contains melanin, the same pigment that gives human skin its color, but in this case, it seems to help the fungus feed on radiation. It's almost like it's photosynthesizing, except instead of sunlight, it's using deadly gamma rays to grow. Experiments have shown that the fungus actually grows faster when exposed to radiation. Most life would die instantly in that environment, but this stuff is growing just fine. Scientists are now looking at it as a potential tool for radiation protection, maybe even for astronauts on long space missions where radiation is, of course, a huge problem. This is a comparison between what frogs are supposed to look like in the forest of Chernobyl and what they look like now. Parts of Chernobyl, scientists discovered something really unusual: eastern tree frogs with completely black skin. Normally these frogs are green or maybe brownish, but in radioactive zones a lot of them had turned jet black, a condition called melanism. Researchers think the frogs are producing extra melanin to protect themselves from harmful UV rays or even radiation. They're still not entirely sure whether radiation triggered genetic changes or just made the frogs crank out more melanin, but it's obvious the disaster played a role. Some of the most haunting images of worn-down abandoned places you'll ever see have been taken in Pripyat. The amusement park is probably the most famous. It never actually opened. It was scheduled to launch just days after the Chernobyl disaster, so no one ever got to actually use it. Today, the Ferris wheel is still standing, rusted and motionless, with the empty frames of bumper cars and a carousel sitting nearby. Everything is decaying, rusted to hell, and completely frozen in time. Picnic tables and benches have been left empty, pathways are cracked, and weeds and small trees have started to take over the area. All this was designed for crowds. Spaces for families, areas for kids to play. It's hard, not to feel slightly somber looking at these images. Well, it doesn't get much more apocalyptic than this picture. In one of the schools in Pripyat, there's a room where the floor is just covered with gas masks. The filters have been looted by people looking for tiny bits of silver inside. What's weird though is that these masks were barely even used. A week before the disaster, students had been trained on how to put them on, but when the meltdown happened and people were being evacuated, they were told not to wear the masks. But why? Well, the communist leadership was worried that if people were told to put on gas masks, they'd panic, i.e. everyone would know there was a serious mess up. So to hell with people's health. The masks were all left behind.
At our number 5 spot and halfway mark, we have the eagles. The lynx isn't the only one making a huge comeback. The mighty white-tailed eagles, endangered across much of Europe, are making quite the appearance in Chernobyl. These birds, perched atop abandoned watchtowers, add to the ghostly atmosphere of the exclusion zone. While their populations are growing, which is great, they are not immune to radiation's effects. Researchers have found tumors, beak deformities, and lower fertility rates in some of the zone's 249 bird species. Yet, the eagles still continue to flourish, reclaiming a land stripped of human interference, but still full of invisible dangers. Next, we are talking about mutated spiders. Spiders are bad enough when they're normal. Mutated spiders are the stuff of nightmares. The spiders of Chernobyl's Red Forest are spinning webs that seem straight out of a horror movie. Their webs are oddly shaped, with chaotic patterns suggesting some very mysterious genetic mutations at play, and even more disturbing, these webs are radioactive themselves, laced with particles that have settled into the environment over decades. The spiders and their prey live and die in these toxic traps, creating a macabre cycle of contamination that illustrates how deeply radiation has seeped into even the tiniest details of life in the zone. In our number 3 spot today, we are talking about bison. The hulking bison of Chernobyl's exclusion zone, weighing up to a staggering 2,200 pounds, are living symbols of nature's resilience, but also its vulnerabilities. These majestic creatures graze on vegetation laced with radioactive particles absorbed from the soil. Every mouthful of grass or bark adds to their radiation load as isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 continue to circulate through the ecosystem decades after the disaster. Their sheer size and strength make them nearly invincible to predators, but radiation exposure has its own invisible consequences. Researchers have raised concerns about the long-term effects on their health and reproduction, including potential mutations, weakened immune systems, and shortened lifespans. Even more unsettling is the role these bison play in spreading the contamination. As they roam through the exclusion zone, their movements redistribute radioactive particles. Despite the risks, like many of the other animals, the bison have found a strange kind of sanctuary in this human-free wilderness. Their numbers are growing, and conservationists cautiously monitor their progress, marveling at how one of Europe's rarest animals has adapted to an environment hostile to most life forms. Next, we are talking about invertebrates. From one of the largest animals to some of the smallest, beneath the soil of Chernobyl's forests, the tiny creatures are waging a quiet battle for survival. Populations of bumblebees, butterflies, and grasshoppers have plummeted in areas with high radiation. The radioactive soil, saturated with cesium-137 and strontium-90, interferes with their ability to lay viable eggs, cutting off future generations. These losses ripple up the food chain, affecting everything from birds to small mammals. Invertebrates' decline is a reminder that radiation's most devastating impacts often begin with the smallest players in an ecosystem. And finally, to end off this list, in our number 1 spot, we are talking about fungi. For this one, we are heading right inside the heart of the reactor itself, the place where this all really started. Deep within the reactor's ruins, black fungi cling to life on the walls of the destroyed core itself. Species like Cryptococcus neoformans and Cladosporium don't just survive radiation, they actually use it as an energy source. Researchers have discovered that these fungi contain melanin, a pigment that absorbs ionizing radiation and turns it into chemical energy, much like plants use sunlight in photosynthesis. This ability, dubbed radiotropism, is as unsettling as it is fascinating, raising questions about what other life forms might adapt to survive in similarly extreme conditions. In our number 4 spot today, we have the wolves with strange fur patterns. There's something jarring about locking eyes with a wolf whose coat looks as if it's been crudely repainted by nature's own shaky hand. Within Chernobyl's silent forests, some wolves now sport baffling fur patterns. Patches that never grew back, odd stripes where there should be solid gray, and splotches of color that defy any recognizable pattern. Scientists suspect that these peculiar coats hint at deep deeper, invisible changes within their DNA, possibly caused by the relentless radiation that seeped into every inch of their environment. What's truly surprising, though, is that the wolves aren't just surviving. They're actually thriving. In a world abandoned by humans, they've staked their claim as top predators, hunting in small packs and darting through ruined buildings like ghosts. Next, we are talking about the mutated wild boars. It's one thing to stumble across a wild boar in the forest, but discovering one with bizarrely shortened legs, an overgrown head, and tusks twisting at unnatural angles is another level entirely. In Chernobyl's exclusion zone, these heavy-set animals have soaked up a cocktail of radioactive isotopes, contaminating their bodies and warping their development in startling ways. Some boars appear top-heavy and clumsy, as if their own skeletons are struggling to keep pace with the genetic mischief unleashed by the fallout. While not every individual shows such blatant distortions, enough of them do to leave an unsettling impression. These creatures are shaped by an environment that continues to bend the rules. Each gnarled tusk and awkward limb stands as a living reminder that radiation does not fade quietly. It leaves its fingerprint on every generation that must somehow learn to survive in its shadow. Next, we are talking about the insects without wings. It's hard to wrap your head around a butterfly that can't take flight, yet that's exactly what researchers are finding in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. Delicate creatures like butterflies and moths, once symbols of gentle transformation, now struggle with stunted wings that look half-grown or never form at all. Instead of fluttering gracefully over the tangled fields, some are left crawling on the ground, vulnerable and off balance. Scientists believe the radiation's relentless tinkering with genetic material disrupts critical stages of growth, leaving wings twisted or completely absent. It's an unsettling sight that strips these insects of their most defining feature. And finally, ending off this list today, we are talking about Przewalski's horse. These horses first originated in Mongolia and were wild horses that became endangered. They first became endangered due to hunters who would often kill the stallion, which of course would provide many difficulties in terms of reproduction. These horses also weren't doing very well in captivity, which made things even more difficult. This, combined with the harsh winters which would often claim their lives, left things looking quite grim for the species. In the late 1990s, however, in an effort to help repopulate these animals, 30 of them were released into the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone, and it is believed that some of these original horses are actually still alive today, which is amazing, but camera trap images have also shown young horses and foals, which means they are repopulating, which is a huge win. They're expanding population in such a harsh environment, which could mean that they might potentially be able to return from the brink and go on to continue as a species, which is something we always want to see.
Pripyat Hospital, officially known as Hospital Number 126, treated people immediately after the Chernobyl disaster. In the hours following it, dozens of firefighters, plant workers, and first responders who were exposed to high doses of radiation were rushed here for urgent care. Their highly irradiated clothing was then hastily dumped in the hospital's basement, which is now one of the most dangerously contaminated areas in Pripyat. The most critical patients were later transferred to a specialist hospital in Moscow, but now 126 sits completely empty and decaying. Equipment sits rusting in the rooms, peeling paint flakes off the walls and the floors are cracked. Beds are still in the wards though, with some torn sheets or medical supplies left behind. The maternity ward, that's especially eerie. It's got cribs still sitting in place and some baby dolls on the floor. Operating rooms have surgical tools left out, and through all of it, nature has started creeping in through the broken windows. These eerie images were taken at one of Pripyat's kindergartens, left exactly as it was when the city was evacuated. The shelves are still filled with toys, some broken, dusty, but mostly intact. Cribs and small beds are scattered around, some with old dolls or stuffed animals still lying on them. The walls are peeling and faded pictures of animals and fairy tale scenes cover the walls. The place is right near the city center, so after the evacuation, nobody came back. At least not permanently. Outside, weeds and small trees are starting to creep in through the windows, and the flooring is cracked and decayed. Even decades later, nothing has been removed aside from the occasional looter. Looking at these images, it's a strange mix of ordinary and unsettling. Normal objects left behind, yet everything abandoned in a hurry. The Azure swimming pool in Pripyat is one of the more unusual abandoned spots you'll see photos of. It was built in the 70s, a large indoor pool, diving boards, changing rooms, a small gym area. After the disaster, the pool stayed open for a short bit, mainly for liquidators and plant workers to wash off contamination, but eventually it was, of course, completely abandoned. As you can probably tell looking at it, the tiles are cracked, faded, and covered in dust. The pool's upper balcony and viewing areas are crumbling with broken railings and peeling paint. The diving boards hang rusted in place, and the pool is empty, exposing the floor underneath, giving the whole building, just like pretty much everywhere else in Pripyat, a post-apocalyptic vibe. Hotel Policia was one of the tallest buildings in Pripyat, a landmark of the city before the disaster. Built in the 70s, it was meant to host visitors to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, along with engineers and city officials. After the explosion, being that the building was so tall, it was actually pretty useful in the emergency response. The upper floors were used as makeshift observation points and temporary offices for the cleanup operations, and helicopters used the roof to coordinate flights in and out of the city. Today, the hotel is completely falling apart. The lobby's empty, with cracked floors and scattered debris everywhere. Broken furniture, elevator shafts are open and rusting, windows are shattered, and graffiti covers most of the walls. On the outside, the building still towers over Pripyat, but the place is deteriorating, with concrete crumbling and metal corroding.
At our number 10 spot, we have voles. Voles, those tiny furry rodents that look like they could be the star in a Disney movie, have a dark secret in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. They are the victims of their own diet. These creatures love mushrooms, and unfortunately, some mushroom species in the area are excellent at soaking up radiation like sponges. The result? Voles in radioactive hotspots show alarming trends. They're less fertile, their populations are dwindling, and their tiny eyes are developing cataracts at an unnaturally high rate. These symptoms highlight just how deeply radiation works its way through the food chain, showing no mercy even to the smallest forest residents. Next, we are talking about the mutated wolves. Wolves are not just surviving, they're actually thriving in Chernobyl's ghostly forests. Not only this, but they might actually be holding a secret that could help humanity. Studies by a Princeton University team revealed that these predators possess altered immune systems, potentially making them more resistant to cancer. Blood samples showed that their DNA has adapted in very unique ways, allowing them to tolerate the radiation-filled environment. Researchers believe these wolves could offer clues to combat cancer in humans. It's quite the twist of fate that the very landscape that should have destroyed them might have transformed them into something extraordinary. Next, we are talking about swallows. Barn swallows darting through the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone are more than just survivors of a nuclear disaster. They're carriers of a microscopic phenomenon that defies all logic. Nestled within their bodies are bacteria that have developed an extraordinary resistance to gamma radiation. These bacterial hitchhikers, exposed to generations of radioactive stress, have adapted in ways that turn one of nature's most destructive forces into a manageable environmental factor. Researchers have observed that these bacteria not only survive in high radiation conditions, but they actually thrive, suggesting that the disaster created an evolutionary pressure cooker that selected these near indestructible microbes. These microorganisms are effectively rewriting the rules of survival at the cellular level, raising questions about the adaptability of life in extreme conditions. Could this be a blueprint for how life might evolve in radioactive environments on other planets, or in the aftermath of nuclear catastrophes elsewhere? Next, we are talking about the lynx. The Eurasian lynx, long thought extinct in Europe, has staged a surprising return in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. With humans gone, these elusive cats have reclaimed their territory, thriving in the irradiated forests. While their radioactive exposure is unknown, scientists believe their radiation levels match other other animals inside of the zone. Hundreds now roam the area, a long way from the extinction that people had thought. It is very clear that Chernobyl has shown us the unexpected consequences of a nuclear disaster and how nature has bounced back in ways that no one even thought was possible. These predators have turned Chernobyl into their sanctuary, a radioactive kingdom where humanity no longer rules. In our number 6 spot today, we have the radioactive boars. The wild boars of Chernobyl are spreading. It sounds like a terrifying zombie movie, and honestly, it kind of is. These radioactive animals roam beyond the exclusion zone, mingling with non-radioactive boars, and then sometimes ending up as food for unsuspecting humans. In 2017, a third of wild boars tested in Germany showed radiation levels too dangerous for consumption thanks to their love of radioactive mushrooms. The boar's mobility ensures that Chernobyl's legacy continues to spread far beyond its borders, turning an ordinary forest hunt into a potential brush with disaster.
Coming in first in our number 10 spot are abandoned dolls. So if you guys have ever seen one of my videos before, then you might already know I have a specific disdain for creepy dolls. And wouldn't you know it, the exclusion zone is said to be filled with broken and abandoned dolls at every turn. Apparently, the specific area is Pripyat, and those that have visited report seeing things like baby dolls sitting in abandoned hospitals, creepy dolls sitting on windowsills propped up on skeletal bed frames sprawled out in piles of debris, and the most creepy of all, wearing a gas mask. Now, to be fair, there is a high possibility that while many of these toys are remnants from the actual disaster, there's definitely some tourism interference. But interference or not, many still believe the dolls are haunted. In fact, some visitors swear they've seen the dolls watch them as they walk along the grounds. So whether you are afraid of creepy evil dolls or not, broken dolls without limbs sitting in the middle of a nuclear ghost town is one of my worst nightmares. Coming in at number 9, a natural earthquake. Okay, so I'll start off by saying this might not fully be a creepy encounter, but it's definitely a strange little piece of the puzzle that I had never heard about until now. Apparently back in 1996, there had been a study to explore the possibility of an earthquake being a partial reason for the explosion of reactor 4. However, experts quickly revealed that report had over 80 discrepancies, and so it was kind of thrown out as a theory. But the following year, in 1997, a separate group of scientists from the United Institute of the Physics of the Earth decided to revisit the study, and they came to an interesting conclusion. So as they reported, the night of April 25th, 1986, which was the night prior to the disaster, 3 nearby geological stations recorded a relatively weak seismic event. Now, normally this probably wouldn't be cause for concern, but according to the study, the earthquake, albeit small, is thought to have occurred a mere 16 seconds prior to the explosion, and could have potentially caused an issue with the proper insertion of the graphite rods designed to protect the reactor, as the facility lacked proper protection from seismic movement. I mean, if nothing else, it's definitely a strange little coincidence. Coming in at number 8, weaponized earthquake. Speaking of earthquakes, inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, there is apparently also some evidence that tectonic weapons were being researched and developed in the Soviet Union at the time. Now, to be clear, it's not known if these weapons were actually ever deployed, but there are some theories out there that suggest that a weaponized earthquake might not be as far-fetched as it sounds. On May 30th, 1992, Pravda, which was the former official newspaper of the Soviet Union, reported that a geophysical or tectonic weapon was actually developed in the USSR despite the UN convention. Pravda, which was the former official newspaper of the Soviet Union, reported that a geophysical or tectonic weapon was actually developed in the USSR despite the UN convention. Now, of course, many higher-ups denied this, but some are sure that they saw it with their own eyes. I mean, it is an interesting theory and definitely makes you wonder what could have been going on behind closed doors. Coming in at number 7, faked photography. So believe it or not, Chernobyl is actually a pretty big tourist destination spot. And along with any tourist destination comes many photos. Now, there are some pretty famous photos that we associate with the abandoned area. However, according to photographer Darman Richter, a lot of these photos we see aren't actually authentic, but rather a facade created to make money off those who love dark tourism. Richter, who visited Pripyat for his own photography, said the city was desolate in many ways and still very dangerous. However, a lot of the chilling photos that have become famous online have been manufactured by photographers looking to create the perfect horror shot. Quote, "I observed countless instances of tourists moving these artifacts around or repositioning furniture for a better shot." He then says, quote, "I watched a photographer arrange stuffed bears and little dolls so that they sat in line along the edge of a bare metal framed bed." I mean, it's no secret that we live in a very curated world where everyone is posting their best moments, but something about trying to curate a disaster zone is definitely a very strange thing to think about. Coming in at number 6, immortality seekers. On a little island in Greece called Gavdos, there is an unsuspecting group of 7 Russian scientists who have created a commune and set out for the impossible, immortality. Apparently their founder, Andrei, had been exposed to high amounts of radiation after a voluntary trip to Chernobyl shortly after the blast. Andrei was, of course, advised to go to a clinic in Moscow for treatment. However, believing it was a lost cause, he apparently decided to settle in a small village and live out the rest of his life there. But this is where it gets a little strange. He lived. Now, this is sort of a conspiracy theory, I will admit. However, there are many that believe the scientists chose Gavdos in an attempt to seize control of the Earth and become immortal. The scientists created a tight-knit relationship with the church, and according to a documentary that was being created about the community, quote, "They feel they need to reconstruct the world and implement the birth of a new immortal human." Apparently, the scientists even began building a Greek temple where they aimed to revive Pythagorean philosophy and unearth forgotten Greek mysteries. All of which is said to be in the pursuit of immortality. Which, okay, I know it's all a little far-fetched, but I mean, if it turns out to be true, it would definitely be creepy.
In our number 10 spot, we have the two-headed calf. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the exclusion zone became a breeding ground for some of the most bizarre and terrifying animal mutations in history. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the birth of a two-headed calf. Farmers near Chernobyl were stunned when they witnessed an animal with not one, but 2 fully formed heads and underdeveloped limbs, a grotesque reminder of the disaster's enduring legacy. Scientists immediately linked this horrifying mutation to the intense radiation that not only killed life in the area, but also twisted the very DNA of surviving species. As the impact of radiation altered the fetal development of these animals, this calf's survival became a tragic symbol of how nature was forced to adapt in the face of devastation. Over time, chilling photos of the two-headed calf circulated, serving as a haunting visual of the unseen toll the disaster took on the natural world, forever etching this mutation into Chernobyl's dark and twisted history. The disturbing sight of this calf is just one of the many strange and horrifying mutations found in the zone, proof that Chernobyl's legacy is still alive in the most startling and unnerving ways. Next, we are talking about the glowing spiders. Deep in the eerie forests of Chernobyl, something straight out of a horror movie is happening. Spiders, those creepy creatures we're already wary of, started crafting glowing webs in the radioactive wastelands. But this isn't just some freakish mutation, it's an odd twist of nature's ability to adapt. The radioactive particles creeping through the area have infiltrated these arachnids, altering the very makeup of their silk and causing it to glow under UV light like a neon sign of doom. It's both chilling and amazing at the same time, a very bizarre, fluorescent testament to how radiation doesn't just destroy, it rewires every part of the environment. Despite the terrifying look of these glowing webs, the spiders seem to be thriving, proving once again that life in Chernobyl might be twisted beyond recognition, but it's certainly not backing down. Next, we are talking about the gigantic catfish of the Pripyat River. No one cruising along the Pripyat River expects to come face to face with freshwater behemoths that could dwarf a grown adult, but that's exactly exactly what lurks beneath these murky waters. Catfish measuring a jaw-dropping 9 feet or more have become a bizarre local legend, their enormous shadows drifting beneath the submerged ruins of old docks and tangled reeds. The strange truth is that these giants aren't sporting visible mutations like extra fins or gnarled faces. What's unsettling is the sheer scale of their growth. Without normal predators around, and with radioactive contaminants subtly affecting their environment, these fish have been free to balloon to unbelievable proportions. They've essentially taken full advantage of their strange new world, transforming from ordinary river dwellers into something that feels more at home in a monster movie. Such extremes of size raise uneasy questions about what the radiation may be doing to the entire food chain and how nature warps when left to wander uncharted territory. Next, we are talking about the albino moose. Nothing quite rattles the senses like catching a glimpse of a massive snow-white moose quietly stepping through the abandoned woodlands around Chernobyl. With their unusual earthy browns seemingly washed out, these pale giants cut ghostly silhouettes against broken fences and crumbling buildings. Scientists believe this unnatural albinism is directly tied to radiation tinkering with the genes that produce skin and fur pigment. What makes these eerie creatures so unsettling is how easily they blend into the Fallout's strange new normal. Towering figures that have adapted to become haunting, colorless symbols of the region's invisible scars. Each measured step through the underbrush feels like a chilling reminder that even the toughest inhabitants of this land have been reshaped in ways that defy both logic and expectation. Next, we are talking about the birds with deformed beaks. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a tiny swallow struggle to pick up the simplest seed because its beak curves at an impossible angle. In Chernobyl's exclusion zone, researchers have reported sparrows and swallows sporting twisted, elongated beaks that look more like poorly bent wire than a sleek feeding tool. These deformities aren't just cosmetic, they can make it nearly impossible for birds to gather enough food, threatening their chances of survival. Scientists link these bizarre changes to genetic damages from lingering radiation, the same invisible force that's quietly reshaping the area's entire ecosystem. These deformed beaks aren't just a tragedy for the birds themselves, but a glaring symbol of how nature, when exposed to something as catastrophic as nuclear fallout, veers down a path it's not supposed to follow. Next, we are talking about the black frogs. Out of all the strange and eerie changes in Chernobyl's exclusion zone, the sighting of pitch black frogs might be one of the most unsettling. Eastern tree frogs, once a vibrant green, now sport deep inky black skin, blending into the desolate landscape like shadows. This isn't just a freak accident, instead it's an eerie form of adaptation. Scientists believe that these frogs' dark skin acts as a natural shield, protecting them from the radiation still lingering in the soil and the air. By absorbing less harmful energy, their blackened color may give them a surprising survival edge in this nuclear-scarred environment. But while this adaptation could be seen as a victory for biology, it's also a reminder of just how deeply the forces of nature can alter life when pushed to the brink, forcing creatures to evolve in ways we can barely comprehend. Bring off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the disaster. We talk a lot about Chernobyl, but how often do we really discuss how this disaster actually happened in the first place? What actually went on that caused it? The Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred on April 26, 1986 in Ukraine, which at the time was a part of the Soviet Union. During a routine safety test, a series of errors and design flaws led to an explosion in reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The explosion caused a massive fire that released radioactive material into the atmosphere, which was carried by wind across Ukraine, Belarus, and other parts of Europe. The disaster was caused by a combination of factors, including a flawed reactor design, a lack of safety, and human error. During the safety test, the reactor's power output dropped to dangerously low levels, leading to an attempt to restore power that resulted in a sudden surge. This caused the reactor to overheat, leading to a steam explosion that destroyed the reactor's upper structure. The accident caused immediate deaths due to the explosion, as well as long-term health effects from exposure to to radiation. The Chernobyl disaster remains the worst nuclear accident in history in terms of the number of deaths and the environmental impact. It led to significant changes in nuclear safety regulations and increased awareness of the potential risks of nuclear power. In our number 9 spot today, we have the operator. This story is one that comes directly from Alexei Brius, who is a control room operator at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and this is his story of the day of the disaster, which starts as he was traveling on a bus to work on April 26, 1986, knowing nothing of the historic disaster that occurred just hours before. As he arrived, he thought, quote, "It looked like it would be a mass grave. I was sure that the whole night shift had died there." He continued on to say, quote, "At the moment of the explosion, I was in Pripyat in my flat. I was sleeping tightly. I didn't hear, I didn't see anything. In the morning, I was to go to work, and so I did. I knew nothing about the disaster. I just got on a bus and went to work. As I was coming close to the station, I saw from the bus that the block was destroyed. I always say that my hair stood on its end when I saw that. I didn't understand why me and other workers were brought there, but it turned out that there was still much work to be done. Me and my coworkers got off the bus and tried to enter the territory of the 4th block as we were supposed to. There was a guard wearing a rubber-coated army suit who had orders not to let anyone in. Finally, they agreed. The guarding sergeant gave us each a pill of potassium iodide. I took it immediately. It was a special medicine made to protect the thyroid gland from radiation. All my life, I remember him with gratitude. The upper part of the reactor and the separator barrel were open. The main circulating pump was seen from the outside. Down the reactor, I saw the reactor's emergency cooling system all ruined. Its pieces were mixed with slabs of concrete. I was stepping over lumps of black graphite. I didn't want to admit what I saw, just like many other people, that it was black graphite." Alexei goes on to explain that he and the other operators had to, quote, "save those injured by fire, debris, hot water, and steam and radiation. We were to find them, carry them out, and deliver them to the medical personnel and go look for others. We saved and brought everybody out except for one person. He is still somewhere there inside the reactor." In our number 8 spot today, a bit of a bit of a break in the really dark story, we have cows. Alright, cows can cheer anybody up. The area around Chernobyl was known for its agriculture before the disaster, so of course that means there were definitely a lot of cows that could be found. While many people who were forced to evacuate had to leave their animals behind, since farm animals are not only expensive but can also be used as a source of income, many people took their farm animals with them. Unfortunately, however, many of these animals had already been exposed to the radiation in some capacity, and while it didn't affect them right away, the newer generations saw much more of the effects. In 1989, many farmers began reporting birth defects in their animals, some being much more severe than others. As time went on, the cows became less mutated, but that doesn't mean the effects went away. As the cows continued to graze on feed that was contaminated, the effects became more internal. This has led to completely normal-looking cows near the exclusion zone to begin producing milk that is toxic and not fit for consumption. While some of the outside and more visible effects of the radiation has worn off, there are still many unseen effects that continue to be prevalent today.
This is the very first photo ever taken of the Chernobyl reactor after the explosion. April 27th, 1986, around 4 p.m., almost 14 hours after it blew. The man who took it was Igor Kostin, a photojournalist from Kiev who flew in on the first helicopter sent to survey the site. He didn't know it yet, but just being there probably gave him a fatal dose of radiation. The foggy look of the photo is not caused by fog, it's radiation. The film itself was being damaged as he shot it. Even standing at the helicopter window was dangerous, which is why the photo was taken from a distance and slightly off angle. At about 200 meters above the reactor, radiation levels hit around 1500 rems. Rem is just a way to measure how much radiation your body absorbs and how badly it can hurt you. 1 rem might give you a tiny chance of getting sick later, 100 rem will make most people seriously ill, and 400 to 500 is enough to kill about half of the people exposed in a month. So 1500 rems, that is insanely high, enough to kill someone in just a few minutes. The helicopter crew wasn't shielded from it, and even the instruments on board maxed out at 500 rems, so they didn't even realize how deadly this was. The air was literally hot enough to start frying their bodies from the inside out, and many of the crew on that flight later got sick from radiation exposure. This image was taken in 1989, a woman holding up a newborn pig that obviously was not born healthy, a clear victim of radioactive fallout. It is grotesque to say the least. One of those images that just makes you want to take a shower after seeing it. I don't really have a lot to say about this image other than it's a very raw photo of the direct effect the disaster had and still has on the animals living in the exclusion zone. You don't need any context to know something went horribly wrong here either. This is a truly nightmarish image. A man lies in a hospital bed covered in thick bandages. You can't even see his face, it's just layers of gauze. You'll also notice he has these metal hoops around his hands holding his fingers apart. Yeah, that's so his skin doesn't tear or stick. He was one of the firefighters from Chernobyl, flown to hospital number 6 in Moscow right after the explosion. The doctors there said the radiation burns were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Not normal burns from heat, but cell death from the inside out. It's hard to find information on this photo specifically. Not exactly sure who it is, but again, it was one of the firefighters who fought the blaze on the reactor roof. Possibly 27-year-old V.I. Starvoit. He had burns over a third of his body and needed to be kept in total isolation because his skin itself was radioactive. Unbelievably horrifying. This is another photo taken by Igor Kostin. These fish were collected from a small artificial lake inside the Chernobyl site, which was used to cool the reactor's turbines. These fish died from radiation exposure. They are abnormally large, bloated, and flabby. Some had just jumped out of the water, making them easy to pick up by hand. It's a clear snapshot of how radiation affected animal life almost immediately after the disaster. The lake was supposed to be part of the plant's cooling system, but after the explosion, it became a toxic death trap, killing everything in it. This was happening everywhere. Rivers, lakes, and soil around Chernobyl were exposed to massive amounts of radiation, causing mutations and massive die-offs of animals. We've mentioned Igor Kostin a couple times now, so let's talk more about him. Igor Fedorovich Kostin was one of the only 5 photographers in the world to actually capture the Chernobyl disaster up close. At the time, he was working for the Novosti press agency in Kiev, and he rushed to the site to document what was happening. His aerial shots of the nuclear plant, showing the full scale of the destruction, were published around the world and instantly terrified people, especially since Soviet media was barely saying anything. They didn't start releasing official information until 2 days later, and even then, they're still trying to downplay things. Kostin didn't just take dramatic photos of the explosion or the plant, though. He went again and again to document the aftermath. He photographed cleanup crews, animals, and of course, the everyday people who were being affected. Patients in hospitals, people being evacuated, whatever he could. He put himself at serious risk, of course, every time he went back, eventually absorbing 5 times the safe limit of radiation and developing health issues later on. He continued his work for years, though, trying to show the world the real cost of the disaster. Kostin died in a car accident in Kiev in 2015 at 78. But he left behind all these incredible raw images that pulled back the curtain on one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. And yet another photo snapped by Igor Kostin. This is the funeral of Alexander Goryev in 1988. He was one of the liquidators who worked on the roof of Reactor 3, the guys they called roof cats, because they were sent up onto the reactors where the radiation was the worst. Goryev ended up dying from a radiation-related illness, one of the many who didn't make it long after the cleanup. These people bravely climbed onto the most radioactive parts of the plant, often with barely any protection. Radiation followed them home, made them sick, and killed them, some almost immediately, others years later. Here's a disturbing image. This is a photo of a member of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences holding a mutated colt. The foal was nicknamed the Gorbachev colt, after a life-size photo of it was sent to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in 1988 to show the effects that the Chernobyl disaster was having on the wildlife. Take a look at its feet. You notice how twisted and deformed they are. Ugh. We hear a lot about animals being mutated by radiation, but I mean, actually seeing physical evidence of it like this, man, it just hits on a whole other level. And this was not a rare occurrence. Birds, cows, insects, as we mentioned earlier, pigs, are all being born with deformities across the zone. There are a few haunting photos showing the evacuations from Pripyat and the surrounding areas after the explosion. On April 27, 1986, around 49,000 people were told to leave. At the time, they were being told it would just be temporary. Buses and trucks arrived to get everyone out, and you notice how no one is wearing gas masks. Supposedly, they didn't tell people to. If they did, everyone would know how bad the situation really was, and like I said, they were trying to still downplay everything. People left almost everything behind. They were told to just bring their documents and a few personal belongings. Pets, farm animals were abandoned, and the areas were quickly sealed off. Over the next few weeks, tens of thousands more were evacuated from towns within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, eventually moving over 116,000 people. Many never returned, but some actually did. They're called samosli, which just means self-settlers. Most are older people who didn't want to leave their homes, farms, and villages behind. It was just all they knew. But some couldn't return to their homes even if they wanted to. This photo shows something most people never realized happened after Chernobyl. They had to bury entire towns. This bulldozer is digging a trench that house there is about to be pushed into. When radiation spread, the Soviet cleanup crews were told to destroy anything that couldn't be decontaminated. Homes, barns, schools. They'd go from village to village, painting big X's on buildings that were just lost causes. And the bulldozers came in, they'd crush the walls, dump the rubble into a pit. In some places, they even poured concrete over it. This photograph was taken in Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, the main facility that treated Chernobyl's radiation victims. After the explosion, dozens of firefighters and plant workers were flown there immediately, many of them barely conscious. The hospital had a special radiation unit run by Dr. Angelina Goskova and Dr. Robert Gale, who were forced to kind of improvise treatments that didn't really exist yet. They had to isolate the patients completely because even their sweat and breath could contaminate anyone nearby. So in this photo, you see a doctor working through a plastic wall using long gloves, treating a patient who'd already had a bone marrow transplant, the last-ditch effort to replace cells destroyed by radiation. These transplants rarely actually worked. Most patients' immune systems were just too damaged to recover, and infections would set in within days. Some of them didn't even survive long enough for their hair to fall out. They were gone within 2 weeks. Hospital Number 6 was full of scenes like this. Rooms sealed off, nurses wearing full protective suits, patients whose skin had started to peel from radiation burns. Visitors weren't allowed, and even doctors had to limit their time near the beds.
In our number 7 spot today, we have the liquidators. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Soviet authorities sent in robots to help with the cleanup efforts in the most hazardous areas. This was an amazing idea until the robots quickly became damaged or destroyed by the high levels of radiation in the environment. The robots faced several challenges, including damage to their electronic components and problems with their movement systems. The high levels of radiation also made it difficult for the robots to function, as the radiation would interfere with the robot's sensors and their controls. Of course, with robots out of the picture, humans were the ones who continued with the cleanup efforts. Known as liquidators, these people were primarily Soviet military personnel, firefighters, and volunteers who were tasked with containing the radioactive material and preventing further contamination, and they faced extreme danger and were exposed to high levels of radiation. Many of these people were working without proper protective gear and in close proximity to the highly radioactive material. Despite these dangers, the liquidators worked tirelessly to contain the disaster and prevent further harm. Many of the liquidators suffered from acute radiation sickness, with symptoms including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Long-term health effects including cancer and other illnesses have also been reported among the liquidators. The liquidators played a very vital role in preventing further harm from the Chernobyl disaster, and they are often referred to as heroes for their bravery and their sacrifice. Many have received recognition and awards for their efforts, but many continue to suffer from the long-term health effects of their exposure to the radiation. In our number 6 spot today, we have the abandoned amusement park. The Pripyat amusement park, located in the town of Pripyat in Ukraine, was set to open on May 1st, 1986, just days after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The park was intended to be a celebration of the town's prosperity and the Soviet Union's technological achievements, but it never opened its doors to the public due to the disaster. The park features a Ferris wheel, bumper cars, a carousel, and other rides which still stand today as an eerie reminder of the town's abandoned past. The Ferris wheel is particularly haunting, with rusted and decaying carts. The amusement park was never fully completed and its rides were never tested or operated, and today it serves as a chilling symbol of the devastating impact of the Chernobyl disaster on the town and its people. Despite the danger posed by the high levels of radiation in the area, the Pripyat amusement park has become a popular destination for tourists seeking to witness the haunting beauty of the abandoned rides and the town itself. In our number 5 spot today, we have The Pilot. This is another first-hand account from right after the disaster, and this one comes from Igor Pismensky, who was a helicopter navigator following the disaster. After the meltdown, helicopter crews were sent out to try and spread decontamination materials over the site. One of these crews was actually killed trying to do this work after they crashed at the site. Of the disaster, Igor said, quote, "They told us there had been an explosion at the plant, so they needed our help. The mission was, after the firemen, to drop down loads of stuff from helicopters to the destroyed reactor. First sand, then lead, dolomite, boron. We would load up about 15 kilometers distance from the reactor. They would put sandbags into parachutes, then we would take off and pass around in a conveyor fashion. There would be a circle of up to 40 helicopters in the air, which would fly over and right above the reactor every 2 to 3 minutes. No one opened the windows. The chopper was all shut, but it was not airtight. It was not protected against radiation. The view of the destroyed reactor down below, after the main fire had been put out, you could see separate glowing reddish fire beds in the first days. This was the view from the height of 200 meters. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, but what we did not have was adequate protective gear for the mission, but that's the responsibility of those who sent us there. Radiation is considered invisible. It cannot be seen, but you can feel it. That is, you can feel a certain metallic taste in your mouth and a sore throat. Radiation never passes without a trace, so the consequences are always there, and radiation usually hits precisely those parts of the body that are the most vulnerable. So for everyone who's gone through Chernobyl, there are consequences. I remember so well the first time we flew over Pripyat town. The whole town had been evacuated by then, but everything looked sort of surreal. Linen is hanging on laundry lines, on balconies, you see dropped bicycles, abandoned cars, no life around, all people gone, but their stuff is still there. When the catastrophe happened, there was the Soviet Union. We had 15 constituent republics playing their part in handling this mess. Today, no country in the world would be in a position to handle the problem of this magnitude if it happened again. In our number 4 spot today, we have the elephant's foot. The elephant's foot is a highly radioactive mass of corium that was formed during the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It is named after its shape, which resembles that of an elephant's foot. The corium was formed when the reactor's core melted down, causing a mixture of melted nuclear fuel, concrete, and other materials to form into a highly radioactive mass. The elephant's foot is estimated to have had a temperature of around 2,700 degrees Celsius at the time of the accident and emitted lethal levels of radiation. The initial workers who tried to remove the elephant's foot from the reactor died within weeks due to the radiation exposure. Today, the elephant's foot remains extremely radioactive and is still inaccessible. It is estimated to be one of the most dangerous objects in the world, with exposure to it resulting in almost certain death within minutes. In our number 3 spot today, we have Kopachi. Kopachi was a village in Ukraine that was affected by the disaster. The village was situated close to the nuclear power plant, and its residents were exposed to high levels of radiation. To contain the spread of contamination, the Soviet government ordered the evacuation and burial of the village, including burying the contaminated soil under a layer of clean soil. Today, Kopachi remains abandoned and designated as a part of the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant. The village and surrounding area serve as a reminder of the devastating consequences of nuclear disasters and the importance of nuclear safety. In our number 2 spot today, we have the plant. It might come as a surprise, but the Chernobyl nuclear plant didn't just shut down entirely after the disaster. Despite the contamination and the risks associated, they continued to use the plant for years to come. Reactor 4, which exploded during the accident, was completely destroyed, and the other reactors were shut down over time. The Soviet government continued to use parts of the plant for several years to generate electricity and heat for the surrounding area, but eventually the plant was decommissioned. It wasn't until December of 2000 that the final reactor, Reactor 3, was shut down. Reactor 2 was shut down in 1991, and 1 was shut down in 1996. It is thought that the plant should be fully out of use by 2028. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the containment. After the disaster took place, the damaged reactor, Reactor number 4, was sealed in a heavy concrete sarcophagus that was meant to keep the radiation concealed and contained. While this may seem like a foolproof plan, plan, there are many debates about how effective this containment actually is, and how effective it may or may not continue to be. These are, of course, super important questions, and considering the fact that it's something we've never really had to deal with before in any way, how are we really supposed to know until we try? The building of a new structure called the New Safe Confinement Structure started in 2006, and it was completed in 2017. The new structure is 843 feet wide, 531 feet long, and 356 feet tall, and is meant to keep the reactor and its previous sarcophagus contained for at least the next 100 years. Despite that relatively short amount of time, experts say that the exclusion zone and surrounding area will remain uninhabitable for the next 20,000 years.
The elephant's foot is one of the most disturbing remnants of the Chernobyl disaster. It's a large mass of graphite and concrete that formed underneath reactor number 4 after the explosion. When the reactor melted down, the materials that were inside started to mix and solidify, creating this massive, oddly shaped toxic lump. It got its name because from a distance it kind of looks like an elephant's foot with large bulbous structures sticking out. The problem with this thing was that it emitted terrifying amounts of radiation right after the explosion. In fact, at the time it was one of the most radioactive spots on planet Earth. People working to clean it up or get closer to it received lethal doses of radiation just by being near. In the years following the disaster, it became clear that the elephant's foot wasn't just dangerous for people who were close by though, it also had an ongoing impact on the environment. The radiation affected the soil, air, and water, and it made cleanup operations even more difficult. For decades, scientists have been worried about how much more radiation might still be leaking from it. One of the most disturbing medical effects from the Chernobyl disaster is a condition known as the Chernobyl heart. It's a congenital heart defect that's been found in people born after the disaster, and it's believed to be caused by the radiation exposure that their mothers experienced while pregnant. The condition causes the heart to develop abnormally, which of course causes a long list of problems, including heart failure, and unfortunately the number of youngsters born with this condition is believed to be much higher than originally reported, and the full extent of it is still not fully understood. A lot of them were born to parents who were exposed to radiation during the aftermath of the explosion, but it wasn't just the immediate survivors of the disaster that were affected, it's also the generations that followed, and it's not just the heart that's impacted either. Other birth defects, cancers, developmental issues, all been linked to the radiation, and some scientists worry that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The death zone around Chernobyl, also known as the Exclusion Zone, is a 30-kilometer radius surrounding the site of the explosion. After the disaster, the area was deemed uninhabitable because of the extremely high levels of radiation. People living within this zone were evacuated, and the area has remained largely off limits ever since. Even today, it's not entirely safe to enter the zone. Some parts have been deemed safe enough for tourists to visit, but there are still areas where radiation levels are high enough to cause serious health risks. One of the most unsettling things about the death zone is how nature has taken over. Wildlife has returned to the area, and some species like wolves and wild boar are surviving in a landscape that was once populated by humans. And while on one hand nature is healing itself, scientists are concerned about how the radiation might affect these animals over time. More on that in a bit. The death zone is this eerie place though, where time seems to have stopped, but the dangers lurking there are very real. Even though the exclusion zone is mostly off limits, the real fear is all the hidden hotspots of radiation, areas where radiation levels are significantly higher than the surrounding environment. They can be found in random places like under trees, in buildings, or in the soil, and they're incredibly difficult to detect without specialized equipment. Some of these hotspots have been measured at radiation levels so high that a person spending even a short time in the area would receive a deadly dose. The worrying part about these hotspots is that we don't know exactly how widespread they are either. Even scientists studying the area have been caught off guard by these invisible pockets of radiation. In some cases, the radiation is buried deep underground, and it's nearly impossible to predict where it might show up next. In the long term, these hotspots could cause serious health issues for anyone who ventures into the area, even if avoiding the exclusion zone. See, one of the scariest things about radiation is that it's invisible. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it. and it can seep into the environment in ways that are hard to track. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, radiation was released into the atmosphere and spread over large areas of Europe. While we know that radiation has a very real dangerous effect on human health, the real fear is how it can stay hidden in the environment. It's in the soil, the water, even the air, and you might not even know you're being exposed to it until it's too late. Today, certain crops in areas surrounding the exclusion zone still have radioactive traces. Scientists worry that it could affect the food supply for generations. It's not just the immediate aftermath of the explosion that's dangerous, it's the long-term, ongoing exposure to low-level radiation that's still having an impact. Along the Pripyat River, a whole line of boats was left behind after the evacuation. Some were small ferries that moved workers back and forth to the plant. Others were service boats used for hauling equipment or fuel. When the fallout hit, the boats were already exposed, so they were basically written off. There was no point trying to save them. They were contaminated, and the priority was, of course, clearing people, not equipment. So over time, they just sat rotting. Some stayed tied to their docks until the ropes gave way. Others drifted a little, got stuck in mud, or sank just enough that only the top half still sits above the water. You can walk along the shoreline and see them rusting in different stages, peeling paint, collapsed decks, broken windows, metal flaking off. One of the most recognizable is a sightseeing boat that used to take people on little cruises along the river. Now it's just sitting there, tilted on its side, slowly falling apart. And these eerie images are what are often called shadow people. You can find these black silhouettes painted all over the exclusion zone, on walls, and stairwells, doorways. They were added years after the evacuation by artists visiting the site. The shapes show kids, adults, and workers, people who used to be everywhere before the city was abandoned. They're not memorials or official markers, but it does help fill the empty spaces left behind. It gives a sense of presence to the people who were forced to leave. They're a little eerie, but it does add this somber beauty to the place too. Here we see the red forest being cleaned up. The dead radioactive trees were cut down and soil was disturbed. Dust containing radioactive particles could easily get picked up by wind and then spread to other areas. So to help stop that, crews sprayed the cleared area with a special solution, basically a type of liquid that soaks into the soil and debris. The solution helps bind the radioactive particles together, keeping them from flying up into the air. It doesn't remove the radiation, but it reduces the risk of it spreading, at least. The red forest is the area right next to the Chernobyl reactor, where the explosion and fallout killed thousands of pine trees almost instantly, turning the needles this reddish brown. After the disaster, the forest became one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Cleanup crews had to go in wearing full protective gear, cutting down trees, raking contaminated soil, and burying it in trenches. The work was dangerous. Every piece of debris, every tree, every scoop of soil was just full of contamination. They used bulldozers and trucks to remove the dead trees and bury radioactive material, creating huge piles of waste covered with sand and concrete. And even decades later, this forest is still highly radioactive. And finally, in this photo, two liquidators are walking through a field inside the exclusion zone. They're wearing those bulky anti-chemical suits and pig muzzle masks. The suits look protective, but they didn't actually do much to shield them from the kind of radiation they were surrounded by. They're mostly meant to keep radioactive dust off their skin, not stop the radiation itself. They're holding these older style radiation counters, equipment that was already outdated by the time the accident happened. It, of course, wasn't ideal for measuring fast changing levels out in open fields, but it was all they had. Their job was to check the soil and the young plants to see how much contamination had settled there. Plants in the field weren't going to be harvested or eaten, of course. Scientists kept sections of land like this untouched so they could track how radiation was affecting the plants and soil over time.
Starting us off at number 10, we have the beautiful red fox. Since the devastating events of the Chernobyl explosion back in 1986, the exclusion zone has pretty much become a ghost town. But only for humans. As far as wildlife is concerned, this place is booming like Vegas on a Friday night. One of the most often seen animals there is the highly adaptable red fox. Red foxes are known to thrive in many different kinds of environments, from urban and rural areas from Canada all the way to Australia, and Chernobyl is no exception. The red fox is not exactly accustomed to humans, especially near Chernobyl, so most of these foxes are not actually scared of the tourists that do explore the exclusion zone every year. Many visitors report that these foxes actually approach them hoping for a little treat. Now, how sweet is that? In a previous video, I don't hold back my fear of the piles of old dolls that also inhabit Chernobyl, but if I have the chance to get close to a red fox and maybe become best friends with it, I might just have to go. But what's actually weird about it? Well, there's nothing that will stick out more in a 35-year-old ghost town of one of the biggest radiation blasts ever than a beautiful red fox. The dolls make sense to me. The foxes, they need to relocate to like my backyard where I can feed them and love them forever because crikey, I love wildlife. At number 9, we have elk. Back in 2018, tourists spotted this large creature in a water tank at Chernobyl. And no, it wasn't a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. It was a poor, stranded, full-size elk. As far as its age and its ninja skills, that is unknown. This large and beautiful creature somehow fell into the water tanks between the 5th and the 6th reactors and was reportedly stuck in the radioactive water for 3 days. Tourists called the local fire department to come and help save the poor animal. One firefighter tethered a rope to its antlers so that while being towed by the boat back to safety, the animal could keep its head above water. The entire rescue took about an hour before the elk was brought up onto the bank, where it then rested for about 4 hours before finally making its way back to the forest for some much needed R&R. No one quite knows how it got in the tank, but many believe it was running away from wolves or some other type of predator and accidentally fell into the tank after. A local radiation expert, Denis Vizhnevitsky, said the radiation dose it had would not be fatal. The elk will survive in spite of taking a big radiation dose. If you ask me, this sounds like the birth of a superhero, you know? Like the wolves chase the elk falls into a radioactive river, it resurges with radioactive superpowers, and then it seeks out its revenge on the wolves? Come on, it writes itself. Joking aside, bless the hearts of everyone involved saving that poor animal. But I would be on the lookout for a mutated elk out there, because after swimming in radioactive water for 3 days, dang, that's gotta do something. At number 8, we have the cousin of the radioactive elk, the radioactive deer. Back in 1986, during the Chernobyl blast, most of Western Russia and Europe was blanketed by a toxic cloud. That toxic cloud reached all the way out to Norway and impacted the wildlife there almost as much as it did in the Ukraine. In central and southern Norway, the migratory reindeer often feed on lichen and fungus, two foods of the reindeer that were exposed to large amounts of radiation from that toxic cloud. These reindeer now contain higher levels of radioactivity that are beyond the European Union limit for consumption, which is a huge problem for the indigenous people of the area, known as the Sami. The Sami heavily rely on the reindeer for being one of their best sources of food, and yet for the first time ever, they're being told it is not safe to eat some of these animals. Just days after the blast in 1986, the government tested the radiation in the reindeer and measured anywhere between 30,000 to 60,000 becquerel per kilogram. This forced authorities to raise the limit of acceptable radiation found in animals from 600 becquerel per kilogram to 3,000, so the Sami still had enough food sources to sustain them. Lavrent Skutterud, an environmental radiation expert of the Norway Radiation Protection Authority, says it is important to remember that the permissible levels are not toxic limits. The limits are instead intended to minimize the amount of radiated food people consume every year, generally trying to keep it below 80,000 a year. The levels of radiation have fallen over the years, and there are still spikes from time to time. While these reindeer were studied in Norway and not exactly Chernobyl, deer are abundant in the exclusion zone and are known to migrate far distances. So, from Chernobyl all the way to Norway, you can find large numbers of radioactive deer. That sounds weird. Coming in at number 7, we have brightly colored birds. That's right, bright colored little birds. Creepy, am I right? Now, okay, I know this one is a little vague, but let me tell you why it's specifically these birds. Professor Timothy Mousseau and Dr. Anders Moeller studied 1,570 birds in the forests and surrounding areas of Chernobyl. They found that the populations of birds that were colored red, orange, and yellow, such as the yellowhammer, have decreased more than those of larger and less vibrant colors. The reason being? Antioxidants and carotenoids. Birds that produce carotenoids have brighter colors. Producing those bright colors, laying large eggs, and migrating large distances uses up a large amount of antioxidants in the bird's body, making them more susceptible to higher levels of radiation and decreasing their populations. Among the species that were most impacted are orioles, blackbirds, quails, hoopoes, and robins. I was really hoping the radiation was the reason these birds were bright colored, and that maybe there was a tie-dye oriole out there or something, but I'm afraid I'm out of luck.
To kick things off with a ghost story told by a nuclear physicist named Andrei Khrushchev after he visited Pripyat in 1997. He toured the number 4 reactor sarcophagus where the explosion had taken place. He was taking readings for radiation when he heard what sounded like screams coming from the inside, which was completely off limits due to the radiation. He described the experience saying, quote, "I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years. And the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I wasn't looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor door is opened mechanically. The reactor door requires a password and handprint, yet someone or something was inside. Later that evening, as we were eating dinner outside the building by the river next to the plant, a floodlight turned on in the room of the installation. There was no way anyone could be inside. As we ate, we figured there was a power surge or something. Then, just as my colleague said that, the light turned off." Next up is the Blackbird of Chernobyl. We've all heard of the Mothman before, who was spotted leading up to the collapsing of the Silver Bridge in West Virginia. Well, eerily, a very similar creature was said to be seen by several control room workers in the power plant just days before the explosion in 1986. A number of men reported seeing this massive, winged, shadowy creature with glowing red eyes flying over Chernobyl. After witnessing the creature, many of the men claimed to be plagued with horrible nightmares. Now, what makes this particular cryptid kind of frustrating is that there's not a lot of info on it. Unfortunately, most of the men who would have seen this thing died in the incident, so only vague stories have been passed on. It seems though that both the Mothman and the Blackbird showed up just before disaster struck as harbingers of doom, or perhaps they're moths drawn to a flame, the flame of imminent death and destruction. Next up on the list, we have the Red Forest. Now, the Red Forest is the most irradiated forested area surrounding Chernobyl. The trees have this reddish color after having absorbed high levels of ionizing radiation. The soil and water is heavily contaminated, but there are a lot of animals that actually call this place home. The boar population spiked as humans up and left. There are plenty of wolves and foxes, but they've evolved in weird ways. More on that later on. But for example, birds in the area actually have much smaller brains than other birds outside of the contaminated areas. We all love to imagine that toxic radiation result in like superpowers or something, but that is sadly not the case, at least not immediately. Eventually nature adapts, but it takes a bit of time. That's going to lead us to a pretty freaky experiment that went on in the Red Forest. So we've already discussed how heavily irradiated this part of the exclusion zone is. Well, this experiment from a few years back makes this abundantly clear. Scientists wanted to test how the radiation affected the insects, microbes, and fungi in the area that aid in decomposition. It seemed that the trees in the Red Forest that died right after the incident in 1986 weren't decaying properly. At the time these researchers were looking into it, it had been about 20 years since the incident, and fallen trees, which would typically be like sawdust and any other forest, were virtually unscathed. So the team of researchers, led by a biologist at the University of South Carolina, Columbia, named Timothy Massow, decided to do an experiment. They filled a bunch of mesh bags with leaves from a variety of trees in uncontaminated areas, then placed them throughout different areas of forest surrounding Chernobyl, some contaminated and some not. They returned after a year, they gathered up these bags, and they discovered that the leaves left in the most irradiated areas were virtually untouched, while leaves left in the uncontaminated areas were basically gone, having been recycled back into the soil by the healthy microbes and fungi. This means that these heavily irradiated areas aren't decaying and regrowing at a proper rate. It also means that there's a very high amount of leaf litter on the forest floor that could lead to forest fires, potentially spreading radiation outside of the exclusion zone. Next up, we have a Reddit post written by someone who decided to venture into the exclusion zone and had an eerie encounter with a set of dolls. They wrote the following: "A buddy and I decided to venture into the heart of Pripyat. Always had a weird fascination with it and just wanted to say I'd done it, you know? Just explore what is basically a post-apocalyptic landscape. First, it was pretty much what we expected. Crumbling buildings, overgrown playgrounds, and the unsettling silence that comes with any big deserted place. But the hospital had to be the most bone-chilling part of the whole trip. Old medical equipment, dusty beds. We even saw a couple dolls scattered around. Now, I've seen my fair share of creepy dolls in horror movies, even supposedly haunted ones in antique stores and stuff like that, but this was different, and it didn't end there. At one point, I swear we heard faint whispers coming from down the hallway. At first, we thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but the whispers started to get more distinct. Buddy joked that the dolls were trying to speak to us, and that's when I got this uncanny feeling. Not saying that was exactly what was going on, but I don't know, something just told me it was time to leave. But as we left the room, the whispers seemed to follow us. We couldn't shake the feeling that those dolls were watching us, their lifeless eyes piercing through us. We'd also taken Geiger counters with us, which started acting up. We couldn't find a logical explanation for the sudden spike in radiation. It felt like the city itself was alive, reacting to our presence. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something about that room and those dolls left us with such an uneasy feeling. Alright, we've all heard about the mutated animals in Pripyat, so let's talk about some specific ones, like the dogs. A recent study was done to see if there were differences between the wild dogs living close to the Chernobyl power plant and dogs living outside of the exclusion zone. Scientists from the University of South Carolina and the National Human Genome Research Institute decided to study 302 of these wild dogs, and the research is still in its early stages, but it seems as if these dogs may be thriving in the harsh environment. After the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, everyone was evacuated, but many pets, including of course dogs, were left behind. There are now thousands of feral dogs living in the surrounding area, so they've been able to reproduce, unlike some animals in the area who seem to have been hindered when it comes to reproduction, like bees, for example. It could be that these feral dogs have built up resistances to the radiation, growing to be more immune to cancer, for example, which would be pretty incredible. But it's not only dogs that have evolved in weird ways since the disaster in '86. Frogs in the exclusion zone have also changed because of the high amounts of radiation. Back in 2016, Pablo Barraco and German Orizuela, two Spanish researchers who were looking into the environmental changes in Pripyat, made an odd discovery: black frogs. Now, a black frog on its own isn't all that strange. There are plenty of frogs that are dark in color, but the Hyla orientalis tree frog, typically found in the area, is a bright shade of green, or at least they were before the radiation in the area seemed to change them. So why are the frogs in this radiated zone darker in color? Well, they've grown to adapt. These frogs have more melanin, which means they're less likely to suffer cell damage from radiation exposure. Pretty amazing, like how quickly nature is able to grow and adapt even in the harshest conditions. Eventually, it just overcomes. Next up, we have another Reddit post I'm going to call Laughter in the Night. It was written by a now deleted user. Hey, fellow urban explorers, I've been meaning to share this experience from my recent trip to Chernobyl. So me and a couple friends decided to venture into the heart of the exclusion zone. We had explored Pripyat during the day, but thought a night trek would be a little more thrilling. We found ourselves near the infamous Ferris wheel. This is creepy enough as it is at night, but my god, I will never forget this one moment for as long as I live. Me and my friends are just bumming around the Ferris wheel. I wasn't paying much attention to what they were talking about, kind of zoning out. I suddenly heard a faint, distant laughter, like children were playing just off in the distance. And it wasn't just me that heard it, everyone went quiet immediately. One of my buddies had the bright idea of following the laughter. I was pretty reluctant, but ultimately we all agreed to have a look. We followed the sound, and as we got closer, it dawned on us, and I knew not, we ended up at a school. The laughter had been coming from inside. Then as abruptly as it began, the laughter stopped. We noped out of there screaming. To this day, we can't explain what we heard. Would you have gone and followed the laughter? I don't know. I feel like I'd like to. Like, that sounds interesting. But I don't know. In the moment, I might have just left. I don't know. What do you guys think, though? Let us know in the comments. All right, let's talk about the reported UFO sightings in the days leading up to the Chernobyl disaster. Turns out, it wasn't just the ominous blackbird of Chernobyl that was seen just before Reactor 4 exploded, but unidentified flying objects as well. So what could this mean? Well, your gut instinct might be that if these unidentified objects were indeed alien crafts, that maybe they played a part in setting off the disaster, that they wanted to cause humanity harm for whatever reason. But that's not the popular theory. Might make you feel a lot better to think of it in a different way, that these supposed aliens weren't out to cause us harm, but to actually help mitigate the disaster in some way. There's a theory that these aliens may have reduced the severity of the radiation, and that something that could have been far worse was contained to one area. What's interesting is that this isn't the only time UFOs have been spotted around nuclear disasters. A series of UFOs were spotted in the days following the Fukushima nuclear disaster as well. So I don't know, this is pretty interesting. There could be something to this. Finally, though, we have phantom radio signals. This refers to mysterious and unexplained radio transmissions that have been reported by urban explorers within the exclusion zone. These signals often appear on frequencies that should be silent or unused. Explorers equipped with radios have described hearing distorted voices and odd sounds that don't sound like typical radio noise, and some have even claimed to hear vague messages coming through these signals. A possible scientific explanation could be electromagnetic effects lingering from the nuclear disaster, but if you believe in the more paranormal side of things, it's said that these signals may be coming from entities who died in the disaster attempting to make contact through the radio.
Number 10 spot, we have the reactor visit. This is a story that was told by a nuclear physicist from New York, Andrei Karsukov, and he told this story after he visited Chernobyl in 1997. During this visit, he went to the power station around 7:30 a.m. and he went into what was left of reactor number 4. This is where the explosion occurred. He began to take some radiation level readings, but suddenly he began to hear someone scream. He said, quote, "I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years, and the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I was not looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor door is opened mechanically. The reactor door requires a password and a handprint, yet someone or something was inside." Later that evening, as we were eating dinner outside the building by the river next to the plant, a floodlight turned on in the room of the installation. There was no way anyone could be inside. As we ate, we figured there was a power surge or something. Then, just as my colleague said that, the light turned off. Maybe the reactor itself is now haunted by the souls who lost their lives as a result of the meltdown. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Chernobyl ghosts. While you can visit certain parts of Chernobyl today that have been deemed safe, taking a trip may not be for everyone, or perhaps it's too far, or whatever 100 reasons there are for not visiting the site. But with the technology we have now, there's another way you can visit the site, and that is through trusty old Google Maps. Many internet people have walked through the streets of the exclusion zone, searching around, seeing what photos Google Maps holds. But with those virtual tours comes something that is absolutely terrifying people, and that is the apparent sightings of what is referred to as the ghosts of Chernobyl. People have reported seeing shadowy figures, sometimes even faces in the abandoned buildings left in the exclusion zone, and I have to admit, some of the screenshots I've seen are pretty terrifying. Do you believe these are real ghosts caught on camera, or is it just a legend like many of the other things on today's list? In our number 8 spot today, we have the blackbird. People in the district of the Ukraine that houses Chernobyl have told stories of sightings of the blackbird for years, and it is perhaps the most well-known legend that comes from the area. The blackbird is a human creature with wings and piercing red eyes, and it was apparently seen by workers at the Chernobyl plant on the fateful day of the nuclear disaster. After this, it was reported that anyone who had seen the bird would later report suffering from terrible nightmares and begin receiving threatening phone calls. Many of the people where the legend originates from, unfortunately, were at the center of the disaster and have since passed away from the radiation poisoning, so no one is sure if the blackbird really is out there or not. The blackbird is said to be a symbol of something terrible being afoot, so seeing it is definitely not a great thing to happen to a person. I think it's probably just another one to add to the list of reasons why maybe a Chernobyl visit isn't the best idea. I don't know, okay? It's for your health. In our number 7 spot today, we have the government cover-up. Of course, a disaster like this is going to get some government conspiracies swirling around it, and this little ditty suggests that the Chernobyl disaster was actually conducted by the Soviet government due to the failure of a new, at the time, huge missile defense radio structure called Duga-3. This structure, that actually exists in real life, is suspected of having been wildly over budget, and it was the source of many complaints after it was built. The systems were extremely powerful and broadcast in shortwave radio bands. They would appear without warning and sounded like a sharp, repetitive tapping noise, and they would disrupt things like legitimate broadcasts, amateur radio, commercial aviation communications, and utility transmissions, which all led to there being international complaints, and at the time, people didn't know what it was. This strange noise actually would go on to gain the tower the nickname Woodpecker for an idea of what the sound sounded like. Because of the fact that people didn't know where the sound was coming from, it led them to think that the signal was actually being used for things such as Soviet mind control or weather control experiments. So the story suggests that in order to eliminate it, the nearby Chernobyl facility was allowed to go into meltdown. It seems like they probably could have done something much less lethal and much less damaging, so I'm not exactly sure how true this one could possibly be, but there are definitely people out there who believe it. In our number 6 spot today, we have the spiders. The spiders that are residing within the exclusion zone are, of course, radioactive, but it's not only the spiders that are now dangerous to touch, it's also their webs. Spiders in Chernobyl are literally making radioactive webs, which is the stuff straight out of a comic book. These radioactive webs are also being woven in much different ways than they once were, which would suggest, of course, some sort of genetic mutation is at play. Spiders were already a creature I'd like to stay far away from. I feel just like tingly talking about them, but radioactive spiders adds a whole new level. Not only are the spiders now dangerous for non-radioactive animals to touch, but walking through their web is equally as dangerous to those who aren't thriving in the radiation. So not only do you have to watch out for regular old radioactive material, but now also get the never-ending construction of radioactive webs. That's amazing. It's so great. In our number 5 spot today, we have dogs. Since we just talked about the cats who were sadly left behind, it's only fair we talk about the dogs too. It's strange that these two domesticated animals would have such different experiences after the disaster, but they absolutely have. There are far more dogs who have managed to survive throughout the years than cats, but that is most likely due to the fact that they aren't as easy to catch and eat as prey as cats are. But dogs have a whole other challenge, and that is they have a hard time hunting and feeding themselves. There are workers who continue to work the dangerous job at the plant, and they continually feed the dogs living in the zone, which is something that truthfully is so nice to hear. It is also said that there are dogs living in this area that have begun mating with wolves, which is only going to breed dogs that will be more likely to be able to survive on their own, which I suppose is a good thing. Similar to the cats, many of the stray dogs are being studied to see if they can be adopted into homes outside of the zone so that they don't have to continue living in these harsh environments that they really were not bred for. In our number 4 spot today, we have European grey wolves. One of the species of animals that has been thriving ever since the disastrous nuclear meltdown has been the European grey wolf. Due to the lack of humans in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, they have been able to thrive, and it has been said that the wolves in this area actually have a population that is 7 times higher than that of comparable sites. Researchers are still trying to figure out exactly why this is happening, but it has obviously shown them that despite the effects of radiation in humans, the radiation clearly isn't affecting the wildlife's ability to reproduce. So this seems like just a regular grey wolf, but here's where things get a little different. Just because the wolves seem to be doing fine doesn't mean they aren't radioactive. These wolves, since they're such a high population, are beginning to travel farther and spread out more, which creates quite a problem. Not that we're just going up and petting wolves, but if you did come in contact with one of these wolves, you'd be getting a high dose of radiation just by touching them. Touching a carcass of these wolves with bare hands is absolutely not recommended. So while it is absolutely incredible to see the wildlife doing so well in this zone, we are now faced with an entirely different issue that we haven't really ever had before. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Eurasian lynx. This one is on this list for a different reason than most. It isn't because of anything this animal is or isn't doing, but instead is due to the fact that this animal was once believed to have entirely disappeared from Europe. It was fairly recently in 2014 that researchers realized they had made a comeback in a big way. Similar to most of the animals we've talked about today, the Eurasian lynx has been able to thrive due to the the lack of human population and interference. Their downfall was attributed to urbanization as well as hunters, and they were mostly wiped out in the early 20th century, although they remained in certain parts of Siberia. There is still a lot more research that needs to be done about these creatures to determine exactly how radioactive they are, and this will take time due to the dangers of the zone they reside in, as well as the nature of these creatures in general. But just being able to see that an animal that was struggling has been able to make such a comeback is probably one of the best things to come out of such a horrible disaster. In our number 2 spot today we have bison. Bison are right up there with wolves for most dangerous radioactive animal, and that is due to their size as well as the fact that they are a source of food for some. These huge animals can weigh up to 2,200 pounds and are certainly not an animal that is easily messed with. Many bison weren't affected by the radiation immediately, and instead it became much more of an issue once they started eating food that had been contaminated. They like to feed on grass, and a lot of it, and the radiation didn't only affect animal life but plant life as well, making their food source a literal feeding ground for radioactive material. Similar to the wolves we talked about before, running into these guys isn't only a threat now because of their size, but now because if you get too close, you could be facing some unsafe levels of radiation. In our number 1 spot today we have spiders. I've talked about my hatred for spiders a lot on this channel, but to be honest, they keep doing cool things, so I have to keep talking about them. Okay, well maybe this one is less cool and more scary, but still, they deserved a spot. Spiders that are residing within the exclusion zone are of course radioactive, but it's not only the spiders that are now dangerous to touch, but it is also their webs. Spiders in Chernobyl are literally making radioactive webs, which is the stuff straight out of a comic book. These radioactive webs are also being woven in much different ways than they were before, which would suggest some sort of genetic mutation at play. Spiders were already a creature I'd like to stay far, far away from, but radioactive spiders really adds a whole other level. Not only are the spiders now dangerous for non-radioactive animals to touch, but walking through their web is equally as dangerous to those who aren't thriving in the radiation. So not only do you have to watch out for the regular old radioactive material, but now also the never-ending construction of radioactive webs. Great.
This image may not look all that striking at first, but there's an interesting backstory here. Months after the disaster, the Soviets wanted a final gesture to show that the cleanup on the roof of reactor number 3 was done, so they ordered 3 men to climb the chimney beside the destroyed reactor and plant a red flag on the top of it. The only way up was a 25-story spiral staircase. Everyone involved knew the radiation up there was still pretty high. Helicopter crews had already tried twice and had to turn back, so the job fell to 3 liquidators. Radiation specialist Alexander Yurchenko, who carried the flagpole, Valery Starodomov, who held the flag, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Sotnikov, who handled the radio and kept track of the time. They were told the whole thing needed to be wrapped up in 9 minutes. Any longer, and the dose they'd absorb would be dangerously high. The men made the climb, reached the top, and got the flag secured over the ruins of the reactor that had blown apart just months earlier. Then they came back down the same narrow staircase, knowing they just stood in one of the most radioactive spots on the planet. Once it was done, what did they get in return? A very Soviet reward. They each got a bottle of Pepsi, which was considered a rare treat at the time, and were given a single day off before returning to work. This is a pretty haunting image, even without context. A guy in a gas mask pushing a stroller. What's the story behind this one? Well, there's not a lot of detail to dive into, but it is exactly what it looks like. A liquidator wearing a gas mask and protective suit pushing a baby in a carriage. The child was found in an abandoned house in Tetsenki while the worker was measuring radiation during the cleanup. The village had been emptied after the disaster, and some people, like this infant, were somehow left behind. Workers had to go through deserted homes, streets, and villages, checking for radiation and making sure no one was still inside. In this case, someone was. This photo is from June of 1986. It's a Swedish farmer wearing a gas mask and a protective suit shoveling feed. Nothing about the scene looks all that dramatic at first glance, aside from, of course, him looking like he's cleaning up a toxic spill, which he basically was. The feed was contaminated by the radioactive cloud that drifted out of Chernobyl. He's not a scientist, he's not a cleanup worker, not someone stationed near the disaster. This is just a farmer. So it goes to show how widespread this disaster actually was. Radiation didn't just stay, over there. Countries hundreds of miles away had to toss out crops, quarantine livestock, and deal with contaminated soil and water. In case you needed some visual proof of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone still being very dangerous, look at this photo taken in Pripyat in 2017. Here we see a Geiger counter next to a metal final claw, rating 679,000 counts per minute. To put that in perspective, a normal background radiation level is usually around 20 to 50 counts per minute. Even a level of a few thousand per minute is considered dangerous for short-term exposure. 679,000? That's off the charts. That's enough to kill someone in minutes if exposed directly. This claw isn't just contaminated, it is extremely radioactive. But what exactly is the claw, though? Here's a full view of it. The claw is a giant crane bucket, like a big mechanical scoop. It was used during the cleanup after Chernobyl to scoop up highly radioactive debris, things like graphite from the reactor core, concrete, and other fallout. After the cleanup, it was left in the forest near Pripyat, where it's now one of the most radioactive objects in the exclusion zone. Here we see a worker in full protective clothing and a mask handling boxes of vegetables in a landfill in Berlin. These vegetables had to be tossed because they were contaminated by radioactive fallout from Chernobyl. The crates are stacked on the ground and the workers sorting and moving them, making sure they're kept away from people. It's another photo that shows how far the disaster reached. The radioactive cloud traveled across Europe, landing on crops in other countries. Authorities had to act really fast, pulling food from stores, stopping it from being eaten, storing it in controlled landfills. Pictured here are Oksana Gaibon and Alla Kazmirka, both victims of the disaster, receiving infrared radiation treatment at the Terrera Children's Hospital in Havana, Cuba in 1994. Doctors experimented with infrared lamps to treat radiation burns on Chernobyl victims. The idea was to help damaged skin heal faster using heat and light to, in theory, help stimulate blood flow and tissue repair. It was not a standard treatment, and it wasn't really proved to actually help anything. Doctors were just kind of trying anything they could. Most care focused on preventing infections, treating burns with dressings and medications, and in severe cases, bone marrow transplants. And the health consequences of radiation exposure might not show up until years down the road. The liquidators were thousands of workers, soldiers, and volunteers who were sent in to help clean up the Chernobyl disaster in the weeks and months following the explosion. They were tasked with containing the radiation, decontaminating the area, and preventing further damage. These people were exposed to high levels of radiation, and the effects were devastating. Some developed cancer, others suffered from organ damage, and a lot of them died in the years following the disaster. They were often given little to no protection from the radiation they were being exposed to. They were seen as disposable and sent in without proper safety gear or even adequate training. For years, their exposure to radiation was downplayed or just outright ignored. It wasn't until much later that the real extent of their suffering came to light. It's said that over 100,000 liquidators were exposed to harmful levels of radiation, and in the years since, a lot of them have developed serious health issues. The liquidators' story is definitely one of the darkest parts of the Chernobyl disaster. This is a group of people sent in to clean up a mess that they had no control over, paying the price with their lives. One of the ongoing concerns surrounding Chernobyl is the contamination of water. After the explosion, the reactor's cooling systems failed and large amounts of radioactive water were released into the environment. This water ended up in nearby rivers, lakes, and the groundwater. There's been efforts to clean things up, but the problem is far from solved. Radioactive particles are still found in nearby rivers and lakes. This means that both the environment and people living nearby are still at risk of exposure to radioactive water. The issue with radioactive water is that it can be difficult to track. The contamination can spread silently, affecting big areas of land and water over time. Radioactive particles can linger for decades, slowly working their way into the environment, and as I already discussed, this can and has led to long-term health issues. After the original concrete structure known as the sarcophagus started to degrade, a newer, larger sarcophagus was built around the Chernobyl reactor. The goal was to contain the radiation and prevent it from spreading further. The new safe confinement, as it's called, is this huge structure designed to last for at least 100 years. Now, while it is a major improvement over the original sarcophagus, there are still some concerns. First of all, it's only designed to last a century, and we have no real idea of what will happen to the thing once it starts to deteriorate. If it fails, the consequences could be catastrophic. The new safe confinement is designed to keep radiation contained, but there's always a possibility of something going wrong. For example, if the structure were to collapse or crack, there's a risk of radiation leaking into the environment. The idea that we have to rely on this temporary fix for such a long-term problem is a bit unsettling. The wildlife around Chernobyl has actually been doing pretty well since humans have left, but there's a pretty disturbing side to that. A lot of the animals are showing signs of mutations. Some are born with extra limbs, messed up faces, problems with their organs. Now, it's not like genetic mutations never happen in nature, but the fact that these kinds of mutations are more common in Chernobyl than in any other place is pretty telling. Scientists think radiation has a big part in these changes, and they're worried that over time this could cause some species to completely die off. Some mutations are small and hard to notice, but others are much more obvious, like animals with tumors, extra or missing body parts, or just high levels of radiation detected in their bodies. Some animals are still managing to survive quite well though. It's just tough to say how all these mutations will affect their populations long term. But the idea that radiation might have changed the very genetic makeup of entire species in the area is a pretty scary thought. Finally, there are the phantom radio signals. These are mysterious, unexplained radio transmissions that people exploring the exclusion zone have reported hearing. The strange thing is, these signals often come through on frequencies that should be totally silent or unused. Urban explorers with radios have said they've picked up distorted voices or odd sounds that don't sound like your typical radio noise. Some even claim they've heard vague messages coming through. One theory is that this could be some kind of lingering electromagnetic effect from the nuclear disaster, but those who lean towards more paranormal stuff say the signals might be coming from the spirits of people who died during the disaster, trying to reach out through the radio.
Coming in at number 5, Bible predictions. There are a ton of wild predictions out there, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you think that prophets and seers really do see into the future or not. That being said, there are some out there that believe the Chernobyl disaster was actually predicted in the Bible. According to the book of Revelations, quote, "And the third angel sounded the trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, burning as it were a torch, and it fell on the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." Now, at first you're probably wondering, what on earth could that have to do with Chernobyl? Well, apparently in Russian, Chernobyl is said to mean wormwood. Now, could this be a coincidence? Sure, but it is definitely a bit strange. On top of that, the fires from reactor 4 have been likened to a torch, and it's believed the third trumpet referred to the accident itself, while the bitter water had to do with radiation. So what do you think? Was disaster predicted in the Bible? Coming in at number 4, mutated farm animals. At first it might sound like something from a science fiction novel, but according to ThoughtCo, just after the disaster, and again in 1989 to 1990, there was a huge spike in malformed farm animals. Many believe this phenomenon coincides with a failure of the sarcophagus, which was a concrete tomb that crews built around the failed reactor in the hope that it would stop leaking radiation or producing deformed farm animals, which, as we know now, didn't quite work out as hoped. Among the mutations seen in the local cattle, pigs, goats, and horses born in the area after the disaster, some suffered from intensely messed up faces, extra limbs, dwarfism, or unnatural colors. In fact, one tiny little piglet became a well-known victim of the radiation. The poor little thing suffered from a mutation called dipgus, which is when they have duplicated lower limbs, and it is definitely not a great sight, I will say that much. I mean, I love little piglets, but this one is definitely giving off more of a creepy horror movie vibe. That being said, you don't need to take my word for it. If you like, you can actually see it for yourself, as it is apparently on display at the Ukrainian National Chernobyl Museum. Coming in at number 3, graffiti. While you might think that most people would try to stay as far away as possible from nuclear disaster zones, there are a ton of people that sneak into the exclusion zone all the time. In particular, a group of graffiti artists who left behind some eerie art all over Pripyat, painted to appear as permanent shadows, assumingly like the actual ones left on the buildings in Hiroshima after their respective nuclear attack. Creepy black silhouettes adorn the abandoned city, creeping out everyone who sees them. In one room, a little girl with bows in her pigtails reaches for a light switch, while outside, a boy pulls a toy truck toward the corner of a building. On other walls, the figures appear to dance, and in a separate section, 3 young people are jumping, or as some speculate, floating, holding onto each other in terror. Those that have seen them in person say they are incredibly eerie and haunting, and some have even ventured to say that the spirits of the lost souls could live inside the walls, haunting the tourists who walk past. Coming in at number 2, aliens. There are definitely tons of theories surrounding alien involvement in the Chernobyl disaster, and while most theories are actually on the more positive side, with witnesses claiming they saw aliens stopping the disaster from getting worse, one witness, Mikhail Varitsky, had a slightly different experience. Quote, "I and other people from my team went to the site of the blast at night. We saw a ball of fire and it was slowly flying in the sky. I think the ball was 6 or 8 meters in diameter. Then we saw 2 rays of crimson light stretching towards the 4th unit. The object was some 300 meters from the reactor. The event lasted for about 3 minutes. The lights of the object went out and it flew away in the northwestern direction." Now, the question here is, was the alien a part of the other group that people say were here to save the planet? Or were they some kind of rival that was interfering and making matters worse? I mean, honestly, I haven't one sweet clue, but any alleged UFO sight is spooky in my books. And last up today in our number 1 spot, the ghosts. Considering that Chernobyl was the location of many deaths, it's not a huge shock that many claim to have witnessed ghosts roaming around the abandoned grounds. But one story in particular really sent shivers down my spine. Andrei Karsakov, a nuclear physicist, was visiting the area back in 1997 and says one morning he arrived at 7:30 and headed over to the number 4 reactor sarcophagus to measure radiation, where the infamous explosion had occurred. Obviously, he was not allowed inside due to the radiation, but as he was taking readings of the radiation from outside, he says he began hearing someone screaming for help from the inside. Quote, "I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years. And the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I was not looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor door is opened mechanically." He went on to explain that the reactor door also requires a password and a handprint, yet he swore he heard someone screaming for help. Then later that evening, as they were eating, he noticed a floodlight turn on, which should have been impossible since there was no way anyone could be inside. Apparently his colleague tried to ease his suspicions by saying it could have been a power surge, but just as his colleague said that, the light snapped off, as if someone was inside listening to their conversation the whole time.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have cows. Cows are one of the sweetest and cutest animals out there, and it totally makes sense why people call them grass puppies. The area around Chernobyl was known for its agriculture before the disaster, so of course that means there were definitely a lot of cows that could be found. Since farm animals are not only expensive but can also be used as a source of income, many people took their farm animals with them, but many of these animals had already been exposed to the radiation in some capacity, and while it didn't affect them right away, the newer generations saw much more of the effects. In 1989, many farmers began reporting birth defects in their animals, some being much more severe than others. As time went on, the cows became less mutated, but that doesn't mean the effects went away. As the cows continued to graze on feed that was contaminated, the effects became more internal. This has led completely normal looking cows near the exclusion zone to begin producing milk that is toxic and not fit for consumption. This is just one of the clear examples of how, even though the visible effects may have worn off, there are still lasting effects that we probably hadn't previously considered. In our number 9 spot today, we have barn swallows. Any animal who lives in the exclusion zone have been affected by the disaster, and that includes those who spend most of their time in the sky. I'm obviously talking about birds. The barn swallows in Chernobyl are one animal who have seen a change in their physical appearance that has lasted all of the years since the nuclear meltdown. It is unclear why these birds have been affected greater than their land animal counterparts, or if these changes will ever reverse to their previous state, but here's what they are currently dealing with. The swallows appeared to have severely deformed beaks, disproportionate feathers, some had partial albinism, and they were seen to have much smaller brains. Of course, some of these issues are much worse than others, and I'm sure these changes have significantly affected their ways of life, but of course they continue to adapt as time goes on. It is sad that this human-made disaster has affected them in such a negative way, but the fact that they are still around really shows their adaptability and resilience. In our number 8 spot today we have boars. Boars are often seen wandering around the exclusion zone, but they also make their way into the surrounding towns as well, which is creating quite a problem. Boars are a fairly common food source and it's not unusual to come across one, but here's the problem if you live in the area. How are you supposed to tell which boars are radioactive and which aren't? Basically, you can't until it's too late. The boars who aren't radioactive might come across and intermingle with one who is, but they also like to eat mushrooms, and if they're searching for their food within the exclusion zone, it's a highly likely possibility that they'll find themselves eating a radioactive mushroom. This is posing quite a problem. In 2017, there was a study that found that approximately 1 out of every 3 boars that were killed in the nearby areas of Germany, which for the record isn't even that close to Chernobyl, have been found to be radioactive and super unsafe for human consumption. You'd think that being that far away would make you safe, but as we clearly now know, the effects of the disaster stretched far and wide. In our number 7 spot today we have Przewalski's horse. These horses first originated in Mongolia and were wild horses that became endangered. They first became endangered due to hunters who would often kill the stallion, which of course would provide many difficulties in terms of reproduction. These horses weren't doing well in captivity, which made things even more difficult. This combined with the harsh winters, which would often claim their lives, left things looking quite grim for this species. In the late 1990s, however, in an effort to help repopulate these animals, 30 of them were released into the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone, and it is believed that some of these original horses are actually still alive today, which is amazing, but camera trap images have also shown young horses, which means that they are repopulating, which is a huge win. Their expanding population in such a harsh environment could mean that they might potentially be able to return from the brink and go on to continue as a species, which is something we always want to see. In our number 6 spot today we have cats. In the rush of the evacuation, many pets were left behind in Chernobyl, and that of course includes cats. With little to do and of course more kittens being born, this paved the way for a group of feral cats to take over the exclusion zone. These cats wander in and out of the zone and find all of their favorite snacks such as radioactive rodents or the less common radioactive insects. These cats certainly have had quite a difficult time surviving, as they are a perfect tasty snack for much larger predators and are certainly not equipped to deal with the harsh winters, but even still there is said to be at least 100 stray cats living in the exclusion zone. There are efforts underway to have the uncontaminated ones put up for adoption, but the difficulty is in testing them and also re-domesticating these animals who have had to fend for themselves for so long.
Staying with the bird theme, coming in at number 6 is the white-tailed eagle. Unlike the small, colorful, radioactive birds, the endangered white-tailed eagle is thriving in the Ukraine. University of Georgia researchers completed a month-long camera study laying dead fish carcasses near the riverbeds of the exclusion zone to see what kinds and how many different predator species would come and feed off the dead fish. James Beasley of Savannah River Ecology Laboratory said, "We've seen evidence of a diversity of wildlife in the CEZ through our previous research, but this is the first time that we've seen white-tailed eagles, American mink, and river otter on our cameras. Imagine watching an endangered species come flocking back in large numbers to feed in only one area. Hey, maybe radioactive fish just tastes a bit better." As much as I love seafood though, I think I'm just gonna leave it for the eagles. Coming in at our halfway point, number 5, we have the European brown bear. Reported back in 2014 for the first time in 100 years, a brown bear was seen in the exclusion zone of Chernobyl. A Ukrainian collaborator for the Transfer Exposure Effects Research Program by the name of Sergei Gaschek set up cameras hoping to learn more about the effects of the radioactivity in the area, when all of a sudden one night on camera, a brown bear decided to make its big entrance back into Chernobyl. Brown bears are not the first large mammal to be seen in the exclusion zone, but it is definitely something to celebrate after a brown bear pieces out of there 100 years ago. Project leader Mike Woods from the University of Salford reported that, "We are basically working on the assumption that as you move people out of the equation and human pressure and disturbance is removed, then any animals that have a corridor into the exclusion zone find they are suddenly away from the pressures and dangers presented by people." So basically, this radioactive ghost town is a heaven on earth for all of our large furry friends. But hey, As long as you got the bare necessities, who cares what it looks like? I wonder if our buddy Bigfoot ever vacations there. At number 4, going down in size from the European brown bear, we have firebugs. Little radioactive bugs who spontaneously combust and fly around the Ukraine terrorizing people. It's mayhem! Just kidding. Sadly, it's not as cool as that. Sorry. Back in April of 2011, our good friends Anders Moeller and Timothy Mousseau were collecting flowers in the famous Red Forest to study their pollen when they came across these little firebugs. They collected a few hundred of these little bugs and compared the markings on bugs from places of higher radiation to those of places of lower radiation. The result? Firebugs from higher radiation spots tended to have missing or deformed markings on them, such as missing dots or eyes, as some others call them. There you have it. What happens when a bug becomes radioactive? It loses a spot. Wow. Starting us off in our top 3 is arguably the most intelligent mammal on Earth. Humans! That's right, we are technically animals, and you can find humans in the exclusion zone almost every day of the year. In one of my previous videos, I told you all that there are actual tours to the Chernobyl site, and around 12,000 tourists visit the site every year. That's 32.8767123 people a day, because that makes sense. From 2014 to 2018, Meredith Yeager, the team leader of the US National Cancer Institute, sequenced the genomes of 130 children that were conceived after the 1986 disaster. They looked at children born from 1987 to 2002, as well as the genomes of the children's parents, with at least one of the parents being exposed to and within 45 miles of the 1986 blast. While the tests proved that the children of Chernobyl survivors and witnesses didn't carry more genetic mutations, some of those originally exposed did develop thyroid cancers. Studies found that more radiation exposed and the younger the person was increased the chances of developing the cancer. But of course, nowadays radioactive levels are much lower and measurements are taken with a dosimeter every single day to verify the safety for human exploration. So, if you want to go to Chernobyl or already have been, please let me know what it was like down in the comments. Coming in at number 2 is a real weird one. A giant catfish. Seriously. Over in Chernobyl's cooling pond, giant catfish can be seen swimming and even the odd time caught by adventurous fishermen. Back in 2016, a video surfaced of the massive aquatic animal in Chernobyl's cooling pond, and sure enough, many people thought it to be some kind of mutated monster fish. But whether we wish it was or not, radiation is not the reason for its massive size. The Wells catfish is a species known to reach gargantuan size. Some of these fish can reach up to 800 pounds, but are extremely rare due to the fact that most of the time they are mistaken for beluga sturgeon, or just exaggerated. It is entirely possible for these creatures to reach up to 350 pounds though, and that is still a massive fish to me. Italian fisherman Dino Ferrari caught one back in May of 2016, and this thing looks crazy. In the cooling ponds of Chernobyl, there is no real competition or higher predators of this giant fish, so it has more than enough food available to keep them packing on those gains and stay well fed. I never thought I would say this, but I think I'm scared of a catfish. Finally, coming in at our number 1 spot is definitely the weirdest animal on there. It's the raccoon dog. These half raccoon, half dog looking animals are a topic of controversy with some authorities, arguing if it is a member of the dog family or a member of the raccoon family, or the much more scientific name for it, part of the Procyon family. Yeah, raccoon sounds better. These crazy interesting animals are native to Eastern Asia, as well as quite common in the exclusion zone of Chernobyl. Once again, this is not a really cool radioactive combination of a raccoon and a dog, but just another animal that isn't exactly sure which family it is a part of. In a study completed by the ecologist James Beasley, it was discovered that raccoon dogs were just one of the many species of mammals that are thriving in the exclusion zone. He even got his picture taken with one, and I gotta say, it's so fluffy! For the longest time, I really wanted to get a dog and I didn't care what breed it was, but now, I think I want a raccoon dog.
A recent study has looked into the wolves of Chernobyl, and there were some very interesting finds, like the possibility that they've developed resistances to cancer. Now, this sounds pretty nuts because you'd think it would be the exact opposite. I mean, with all the cancer-causing radiation, you'd think the wolves would be suffering from cancer, not becoming immune to it. But Dr. Kara Love, an evolutionary biologist and ecotoxicologist at Princeton University, has found quite the opposite. She, along with a team of researchers, headed to Chernobyl in 2014 and placed radio collars on a number of wolves to track their movements. The collars gave the team real-time measurements of where the wolves were and how much radiation they were being exposed to. They also took samples of their BLOOD to analyze, and the study found that the wolves were being exposed to 6 times the daily legal safety limit of radiation per day. The wolves seemed to have altered immune systems similar to people undergoing radiation therapy for cancer, and there were parts of their genes that seemed to have built a resistance to this increased cancer risk. Now, unfortunately, the past few years haven't really been ideal for continuing these studies for obvious reasons, but hopefully they can start diving into this more soon because the research could assist in cancer treatment for humans, which would be amazing. This is Jeremy Wade, host of Animal Planet's River Monsters, and he's holding a really big catfish, which he caught in the Chernobyl power plant cooling pond, which is home to massive-sized catfish which have become a bit of a tourist attraction. Wade stated that this particular fish here was 16 times more radioactive than normal, but as big as these catfish are, their size may not actually have to do with the radiation at all. Now, while there may be mutations and defects in some of these catfish, the larger than average size is more to do with the fact that they're at the top of the food chain here. There's just no fish hunting them, and with no competition for food and plenty of it to eat, they grow pretty big. Plus, people have been flocking to the area to feed them, so that definitely helps as well. And they're reproducing at high rates and living nice long lives from the looks of it. But hey, they're still radioactive, so even though they do seem perfect for a nice seafood fry-up, that is still highly advised against. Once on the verge of extinction, a wild species of horse native to Asia called the Taki horse are now thriving in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. 30 of these horses were reintroduced to the area in 1998, and they've adapted remarkably well to their new environment. In the early days, scientists were a bit concerned about how these horses would cope in such a harsh, contaminated environment, but over time it became clear that they were managing to survive, but not without some consequences. One of the noticeable effects has been on their growth. While they're not necessarily growing uncontrollably, there are subtle signs that radiation has impacted their health and their development. For example, some of these horses have had stunted growth or issues with their hooves, which might be caused by the increased radiation exposure. For the most part though, they're doing pretty well. Their population has expanded, and considering they were basically extinct by the 20th century, that's pretty good. Out of all the animals now flourishing in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the ones with the highest level of radiation are wild boars. But why? Well, it turns out it mostly has to do with what they eat. Not only do these boars feed on plants and insects that have been contaminated with radiation, but they also eat a lot of deer truffles, a type of mushroom which they dig up from the ground. And of course, a lot of radioactive material accumulates in the soil, so these boars are just soaking up radiation, which has led to some pretty noticeable effects. They've been seen with deformities and health problems like strange growths and tumors. The radiation messes with their cells, leading to these weird and often unhealthy growth patterns. They might not be growing bigger in a normal sense, but their bodies are showing signs of stress and mutation. The high levels of radiation affect their immune systems, making them more susceptible to diseases and infections, so while they are surviving, they may not be thriving as much as some of the other animals in the area. Moving on to a much smaller animal now, mice. These little critters are everywhere in Chernobyl, and they've become the focus for a lot of scientists studying radiation in the CEZ. They're usually used in experiments because they breed quickly and have relatively short lifespans, so it makes observing the effects easier, unfortunately for them. And in Chernobyl, mice have shown some pretty strange changes because of the radiation. For starters, their growth patterns are all over the place. Some mice have had stunted growth, others seem to grow abnormally large in certain areas of their bodies. Essentially, the radiation interferes with the mice's DNA, leading to all sorts of odd and sometimes, sadly, harmful physical changes. Researchers have also found that these mice have a higher rate of cancer and other diseases. The radiation messes with their cells, making it harder for their bodies to stay healthy. And what's really scary is that some of these issues are then passed down to their offspring, creating a sort of ongoing cycle of problems. But even still, they've managed to adapt in their own way. I mean, maybe they're not thriving as well as they would be if the area wasn't full of radioactive fallout, but they're still in an environment where humans aren't roaming around, so they're living. There's a lot of them, and their population just continues to grow. There are tons of birds in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone as well, but they also have a lot of defects. From 1991 to 2006, studies of barn swallows in the exclusion zone revealed some serious issues. A lot of them were found to have deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, meaning they were unusually pale or even white. Now, this not only makes them more visible to predators, but it can also affect their ability to regulate their body temperature. Tail feathers are another problem. Instead of being straight and sleek, many of these birds have bent or twisted tail feathers, which can affect their flying. And it's not just their appearance that's affected, their air sacs, which help them breathe, are often deformed as well. And birds in the exclusion zone seem to have fewer chicks that survive to adulthood compared to those in less contaminated areas. Studies have also shown that these birds often have smaller brains and malformed sperm. Bison. These impressive creatures have been roaming the exclusion zone for years. European bison are the largest land mammals in Europe, and they've had to adapt to a very different kind of wilderness in Chernobyl. But these animals seem to be flourishing even though they were exposed to high levels of radiation through the plants that they eat. Some of them have seen some strange health issues like your typical growths and tumors, deformities in their hooves, but the bison population in Chernobyl is pretty stable. It's almost like it's safer for these animals to be in a place with no people and higher amounts of radiation than in an area with little to no radiation and humans walking around and yelling and farting and leaving their Dorito bags everywhere. What would you choose if you were an animal? Higher radiation, no people, more people, no radiation. The lynx population has exploded in Chernobyl. Or maybe it makes more sense to say that it just formed. See, before the disaster, it was very rare to see lynx in the area. As stated by biologist Valery Yurko, lynx would show up sometimes, but because the area was so densely populated, they would never stay. In the years since the disaster in '86, elk and boar populations have grown. There are way more deer than there were before, so with all this food to hunt and no human interference, more predatory animals like the lynx have moved into Chernobyl and the areas surrounding it. And they hunt differently too. There are a lot more opportunistic and bold because they're not worrying about hunting animals like ducks that hang out in more open areas because they just aren't concerned about being spotted and hunted by people. Typically, lynx would hunt in more forested areas where the trees offer some protection, and that's just not the case when it comes to Chernobyl. Along with lynx, brown bears have also started moving into the exclusion zone, which they hadn't called home for over a century. So what's going on with these bears? Well, they're big, they're hungry, which means they need a lot of food. The exclusion zone, with its overgrown vegetation and all the wildlife, just makes for plenty of foraging opportunities. Bears are opportunistic feeders, so they take advantage of the environment, eating everything from berries to small animals, and even with the radiation, bears seem to be adapting well. They've been spotted roaming across the zone, forming territories and hunting in the area. Finally though, how could we not talk about all the green stuff? The flora. It's doing great for the most part. Nowhere is this more immediately noticeable than in Pripyat, the ghost town now being completely overtaken by nature. In the years since the disaster, the area around Chernobyl has transformed into a very unique kind of wilderness. The plants have been free to grow as much as they want with no human interference, and it's created all these new habitats for animals. Trees, bushes, vines, weeds, it's all spreading across the streets. It's growing over buildings and the insides of the old apartments. Nature is taking over every nook and cranny of the city, and that's pretty cool. The way wildlife has adapted and thrived after something as disastrous as this really goes to show how resilient nature is.
According to a study that began in 1991, the organisms responsible for decomposition and replenishing organic matter back into the ecosystem, such as insects, fungi, and microbes, are presenting symptoms of radioactive contamination, which isn't too shocking, but still isn't good. One of the most prominent areas of this effect has been called the Bloody Red Forest. It's a set of woodland where all the pine trees turned a blood red color right after the meltdown and then died not long after. Now it's pretty, don't get me wrong, but it's completely unnatural and has caused some issues. Now 15 to 20 years after they were exposed to radiation and died, these trees were not decaying, when at this point normal trees would be long gone. Due to this, scientists decided to run some tests by filling specially prepared garbage bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, making sure there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags out in both contaminated and uncontaminated wooded areas in the exclusion zone for nearly a year to check the decomposition rates of the leaves. Now, bags left in uncontaminated areas were as expected, with normal rates of decomposition between 70 to 90% of the leaves decomposing. But the leaves in contaminated areas retained 60% of their original weight, indicating much less activity by natural decomposers. Now, this suggests that the radiation exposure has a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients, which could be causing the stunting of tree growth that has been recorded. But with this comes another problem. The leaves in contaminated areas stayed intact and dry even after almost a year, and this could present a fire hazard, which in turn presents a danger of radioactive contaminants being spread outside the exclusion zone by forest fires. So that is scary and just not good at all. Then there's how this affected all the animals. According to a 2011 study in Biological Conservation, Chernobyl caused genetic mutations in plants and animals increased by a factor of 20. Among breeding birds in that region, rare species suffered disproportionate effects from the explosion's radiation compared to common species. Now, further research is needed to understand how the increased mutations affect species' reproductive rates, population size, genetic diversity, and other survival factors, but it definitely affected animals in a negative way. In 2016, a study found that the eastern tree frogs in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone exhibited different characteristics than their neighboring cousins, and in 2023, another study discovered distinct genetic differences between Chernobyl dogs and dogs living only 10 miles away in Chernobyl City. Now, not all the animals living around Chernobyl are entirely wild, as there are around 900 stray dogs, mostly descended from those left behind when people evacuated the area. Veterinarians, radiation experts, and volunteers from a group called the Dogs of Chernobyl captured the dogs, vaccinated them against diseases, and tagged them. Now, in addition to the tags, some dogs are fitted with radiation detector collars. Now, the dogs offer a way to map radiation across the Chernobyl exclusion zone and study the ongoing effects of the accident. While scientists generally can't get a close look at individual wild animals in the zone, they can monitor the dogs closely, and they are, of course, radioactive. Visitors to the area are advised to avoid petting the dogs to minimize radiation exposure, no matter how cute they are. Now, these dogs have increased rates of cataracts because the eyes are the first tissues to show signs of chronic exposure to ionizing radiation. Now, not all is lost on these dogs though, as the unique genetic diversity of these dogs makes them ideal candidates for future studies, seeking to understand the long-term genetic health effects of highly radioactive environments on populations of large mammals, especially in understanding the biological underpinnings of human survival in regions of high and continuous environmental assault, the researchers said. So, I guess that's a plus. Then there's the birds. While there are plenty of them in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, 489 different species to be exact, they are examples of animals that still face problems from radiation exposure. A study of barn swallows from 1991 to 2006 indicated birds in the exclusion zone displayed more abnormalities than birds from a controlled sample, including deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, bent tail feathers, and deformed air sacs. Now, birds in the zone had less reproductive success, and these birds often had smaller brains, malformed sperm, and cataracts, presumably as a result of radiation-related genetic mutations. Now, if you were already scared of spiders, these ones will freak you out even more. The spiders here are radioactive as they build their webs to catch their prey. They add to the dangerous environment of the forest. These webs are not like normal spider webs. In fact, they are woven in abstract ways that suggest genetic mutation is at hand. Now, they're also highly radioactive themselves, making them a danger for any non-radioactive animal to touch. Now, who knew spiders could get 100 times scarier? But that's not the only scary mutated animal there. According to Slate in the early 90s, which was just a few years after the incident, radiation levels in the wild boar that died near Chernobyl were more than 2,000 times what's considered safe. And even today, eating animals from inside the exclusion zone is still pretty hazardous, as a person might be exposed to radiation levels that are dozens of times higher than what's safe. Then in 2016, a video went viral of a catfish swimming around the cooling pond of the Chernobyl power plant. Very few mutations lead to extra large size, explains University of South Carolina radiation specialist Dr. Timothy Masu. Instead, they grow less efficiently, they're less capable of catching food, and they tend to not live as long. Now that's why it's shocking that it's so large, and I would not want to mess with a fish that big. Then as of 2015, there had been almost 20,000 cases of thyroid cancer reported in people who were exposed at the time of the incident. And approximately 5,000 of these thyroid cancers are likely attributed to them drinking fresh milk containing radioactive iodine from cows that had eaten contaminated grass in the first few weeks following the incident. Yep, you heard that right. The cows created radioactive milk. Now in 2018, it was said that Ukraine still has radioactivity levels up to 5 times the official safe limit, research suggests. Now scientists sampled cow's milk from private farms and homes in the Ravine region, about 125 miles away from the site of the catastrophic explosion. Researchers found levels of radioactive caesium in milk above Ukraine's safe limit for adults of 100 becquerel per liter at 6 of 14 settlements studied. Now the highest levels found were about 500 BQ liter, 5 times over the limit for adults, and more than 12 times that for the young. The study was carried out at the University of Exeter and the Ukrainian Institute of Agricultural Radiology. More than 30 years after the Chernobyl disaster, people are still routinely exposed to radioactive caesium when consuming locally produced staple foods, including milk, in Chernobyl-affected areas in Ukraine, said Dr. Irina Lebunska of University of Exeter. Though the level of soil contamination in the studied areas is not extremely high, radioactive caesium continues to accumulate in milk and other foods. Now this is just one of the lasting effects, which is horrific. On a lighter note though, an endangered wild horse is making a comeback thanks to Chernobyl. The Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute called the Przewalski's horses the last truly wild horse. Its once large population that ranged across large areas of Asia and Europe was eventually reduced to almost nothing. When Lee Boyd and Catherine A. Hope edited a book about the animal in 1994, the most recent wild sighting had occurred in the late 60s, leading the authors to declare them extinct in the wild. But British ecologists Mike Wood and Nick Beresford, who specialize in studying the effects of radiation on Chernobyl's wildlife, observed that the Przewalski's horses is thriving within the exclusion zone. In the late 1990s, about 30 of these horses were released in the Ukrainian side of the zone, and the population has increased to more than 200. Based on camera trap images, Wood estimated that some of the original horses, identified by their brand markings, are still alive, and photos of juvenile horses also indicate that the population is expanding. And finally, if you didn't know, Earth has both a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protects us from dangerous radiation. Now NASA knows that astronauts on the International Space Station get exposed to 20 times the radiation we get down here on the planet. So after discovering that a fungus thriving around the heavily radiated Chernobyl disaster site consumes radiation through radiosynthesis, they decided to experiment with it in space, and over the course of a month they found out that the fungus actually blocks radiation literally by eating it. The experiments on the ISS revealed that it was utilizing melanin to transform radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy. Now this is actually really exciting because this ability may turn out to be useful in future space exploration. NASA is hoping that the fungus may be used to both shield equipment and the crew from deadly radiation during long space flights, and even more importantly, help clean up radioactive waste. In our number 5 spot today, we have the alien invasion. Okay, it seems absolutely insane, but there is an alien conspiracy that actually revolves around Chernobyl, and there are people who believe it's true. There is part of this theory that I like, and that is because it basically suggests that aliens saved humanity. Yeah, in this story, they didn't cause disaster or try to steal our planet, and instead, they saved us from a complete and total meltdown. What happened, and how this all started, is that around the same time of the Chernobyl disaster, people reported spotting a number of UFOs. One witness even said that they saw a UFO for 6 hours. So basically, because of this uptick in sightings, people believe that the aliens came to help sort of diffuse some of the radiation levels that were seen after the disaster. This would have helped to prevent an even larger blast with an even higher amount of death and illness. This is sort of a conspiracy brought up to explain how, while this meltdown was of course catastrophic, it didn't leave like apocalyptic level damage, which believers of this theory said there should have been. So what do we think? Did aliens come to save the planet? In our number 4 spot today we have The Musician. This is a story that comes from a redditor named Jake, but this actually isn't Jake's story. This is the story of a man named Yuri who Jake met at a bar in Finland. Yuri is actually a Chernobyl survivor, and he had quite the harrowing tale to share with Jake. Yuri is a musician, and at the time of the disaster he was in a state-sponsored musical dance troupe. Basically, as soon as the disaster happened, this group was called upon by the government to come in and calm the people living in the area. Yuri said, quote, "Mere hours after the meltdown commenced, our bus entered the exclusion zone at checkpoint Dityatki. We were told not anything, and the soldiers made it forbidden for speaking with the village people. Imagine not knowing a disaster taking place, yet seeing the strange workings of the radioactivity all around. Everyone was sick and dying, yet quarantined and not allowed to leave the zone." This is all chilling, but this is where the story takes a terrifying turn. He begins to describe their final performance, which was in Pripyat. The ballerina danced, knowing something horrible had happened, and she danced like never before, and she even let her hair down from her bun to just let it flow. Suddenly though, Yuri noticed that these locks of hair weren't just falling out of her bun, they were falling down to the ground. Basically, Yuri ends off his story by explaining his escape, which was through back roads and avoiding military checkpoints, and he ends off by saying that he is the only one of his group to survive. In our number 3 spot today we have barn swallows. Any animal who lives in the exclusion zone has to have been affected by the disaster, and that includes those who spend most of their time in the sky. I'm obviously talking about birds. The barn swallows in Chernobyl are one animal who have seen a change in their physical appearance that has lasted all of the years since the nuclear meltdown. It is unclear why these birds have been affected greater than their land animal counterparts, or if these changes will ever reverse to their previous state, but here's what they are currently dealing with. The swallows appeared to have severely deformed beaks, disproportionate feathers, some had partial albinism, and they were seen to have had much smaller brains. Of course, some of these issues are much worse than others, and I'm sure these changes have significantly affected their ways of life, but of course, they continue to adapt as time goes on. It is sad that this human-made disaster has affected them in such a negative way, but the fact that they are still around really shows their adaptability and their resilience. In our number 2 spot today we have the Chernobyl zombies. This little legend that comes from within the exclusion zone claims that after the Chernobyl disaster, we of course know that unfortunately people lost their lives, but what happened if those who did then became the undead? We're obviously talking about zombies here. There are plenty of legends that suggest the exclusion zone isn't dangerous and off limits because of the toxic radiation, but actually because there are brain-eating zombies wandering the area. I mean, I personally have never received a lethal dose of radiation, so I cannot confirm nor deny that this would turn one into a zombie, but I'm gonna go ahead and call this one most likely fake. I mean, at least I am really hoping it is. We're dealing with enough as a society. We don't need zombies on the list. This little legend can most likely be attributed to a video game that takes place in the exclusion zone, but it certainly is not based on any real life facts, at least that we know of. Finally, in our number 1 spot today we have The Stalkers. Speaking of that video game, which is called Stalker, it might have inspired the tales of the zombies, but it also apparently has inspired some to try and sneak into the exclusion zone themselves. This popular game set in the zone has made some people try and sneak into it themselves in real life in order to live out the game. You know, like a LARPing scenario, but the only enemy this time is radiation. Basically, there are these people who are now being referred to as stalkers, and they are said to be sort of romanticizing the exclusion zone. They like to sneak in, explore the ruins, sleep in the abandoned buildings, and sometimes even bring in a device to show them how much radiation they're being exposed to, which is pretty frightening. Despite these dangerous explorers sharing their nickname with the video game, however, the name actually comes from characters in the novel Roadside Picnic, which was turned into a classic Soviet film entitled Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. The term stalker is meant to refer to thieves who sneak into places that are harboring lethal secrets. Some even tried to tempt fate even more by doing things like eating fruit that they found growing in the zone. Because of the fact that this place is meant to be off limits, many of those sneaking in here who consider themselves stalkers wear things like paramilitary gear, they wear gas masks, balaclavas, and other things to cover their face. All in all, it's very dangerous and also very unsettling.